Welcome to this masterclass on the topic of the pathway to naturalise as part of an Indigenous community. We're going to focus on the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples to simply provide a framework for the discussion. But the reality is this topic has to do with many contemporary topics, such as, for example, Israel, Palestine, Gaza, Arabs versus Jews, Druze, the different Indigenous people of those areas, but also worldwide, the more familiar First Nation Aboriginals of Canada, of the United States of America, the Aborigines of of Australia, the Commonwealth of Australia, and also the Indigenous peoples here in Great Britain, but also, of course, applying equally to other parts of the world, such as to Nepal and Tibet. So the object here is to equip you with skills so that you can better debate with people on the topic that you prefer to debate, no matter what your politics are. The wonderful thing about Indigenous politics, let's say you were to write an Indigenous manifesto, it would apply equally to the left, to the right, and betwixt. This is the extraordinary thing. So, in context, I'm not going to discuss specifically what is an Indigenous people. We're going to imply it by looking at the actual United Nations declarations. There are 46 articles in the declarations for the rights of Indigenous peoples. In particular, we're going to focus on Article 33, because Article 33 goes and lays down the pathway, the structure, from which one can quite confidently go and argue the pathway to become an Indigenous member of a community at the starting point of not being Indigenous and simply being outside that. So let's have a couple of examples of how this may happen. So let's just do a broad look at Great Britain. Let's say you're an immigrant coming in and you wanted to naturalise here in the country. You'd have various choices. One of them would be to naturalise as English, another would be to naturalise as Welsh, another would be to naturalise as Scottish. I'm going to put Northern Ireland to one side, although I'll bring it up later and that will explain why. But another opportunity is to naturalise as an Indigenous cult. And I'll go and give an example, and from time to time during this discussion I'll go and refer to it, but this is just simply an introduction of me. So I'm a 28th generation family head. We know this because my coat of arms, etc., goes and records that we were here in the county of Cumberland in 1056, during which time Cumberland was part of Scotland. And clearly then, my ancestors in 1056, who we know had actually immigrated from Belgium from around Tongeren, so this is the origin story of my family, in which, by the way, we're known as the Harrisons of the North. If you were to simply do a fact check on me, do a deep dive into coats of arms, and within those coats of arms you will find one that has the following coat of arms. I'm going to describe the blazon to you. So it's basically, how does it go? It goes or, meaning OR, gold, or on a chief sable, 3 eagles displayed of the first, or 3 eagles displayed of the field. Look, to visualize that, the coat of arms, the shield is gold, there's a black band at the top, and there are 3 golden eagles there. And the reason why I suggest that is if you do a deep dive in terms of fact checking me, you will find that the Royal Heralds of the College of Arms in centuries past have identified our family. They refer to us as the Harrisons of the North. The reason they do that is to distinguish us from Sons of Harry, because we didn't derive our name from Sons of Harry. We had a Hebrew sounding name that was actually ecclesiastic Hebrew from the 9th century, and it's spelled Haruson, which sounds like Harrison in the northern dialect as it was centuries ago. And in that sense, we were known as the Harrisons of the North. The peculiarity, of course, is when we arrived here in 1056, surnames weren't in vogue. We were actually princes from a princely family from another region simply coming in. So that goes and explains my context. But in similarity to most other families here in the county of Cumberland, most old families can trace their heritage back 6, 7, 8, 9, 1,000 years. 900, I should say, 6, 7, 8 and 900. And in doing so, we're all very similar in that context. There are different ranks within the county of Cumberland, such as statesmen and yeomen and others, landed gentry, aristocrats. And in those contexts, a bit of a picture starts to get played that goes and simply shows where we've come from, where we believe we are in the Indigenous sense, and therefore look forward to going. And in that context, even we can use the 46 articles, I forgot the number for a moment, the 46 articles of the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples as a structured format for simply validating and verifying not only our right to communicate by this, but also our right to not be oppressed by other peoples. Now look, that goes and shows my family background, and I want to use that simply to jump across to 10th century Wales. And in 10th century Wales, the kingdoms, of course the Welsh kingdoms were there, and it wasn't so much known as Wales back in those days, it was simply various different kingdoms. And one of the kingdoms in particular had detailed down the actual Welsh law of the kingdom, and this is to believe to be in parallel to most other kingdoms of that age. And we can quite clearly go and derive some parallels in the actual expressions and names. And because the underlying Celtic nature of Indigenous Britain is actually Brythonic, it's not Goidelic, because that's the underlying Celtic nature in the island of Ireland, that is Ayr. And this is why, to a certain degree, I'm leaving Northern Ireland out of the conversation to start off with, as will become apparent why later. So, just in short, as a summary introduction, I'm just simply going to add one thing. I'm going to draw some information from those 10th century Welsh laws, something else which you can also fact check if you want to do a deep dive into them. Now, the head of a kindred was known as a pen cenedl. That's spelt P-E-N-C-E-N-E-D-L, pen cenedl. Pen means chief or head, and in various aspects it can mean other things as well, for example, lord. But generally in this context, pen means head, because cenedl means kindred, so pen cenedl means head of the kindred. Now, if you do a deep dive into those Welsh laws also, you'll also find how big a family was considered to be, and also how the actual pen cenedl went and derived his status. And his status basically was this: he was the senior male family head, and if you went and traced his lineage back 10 generations, that is to his 10th ancestor, so really that's tracing back 9 generations. And in this context, we tend to refer this simply as the pen cenedl is somebody whose heritage is of the 9th degree. But if you go back simply from the head of the family all the way back up the male line to the 10th generation ancestor, then everybody, no matter how the actual family tree comes off him, all of his descendants, anybody descended from that 10th generation then family head, would have now, or shall I say now, constitutes the actual breadth of the family of this current family head. So in any generation going back, so I've got 28 generations I can count back, you can simply go and take any one family head at a particular time, and you can count back the 10th generation, find out who that chap was, and then everybody down to the current family head under investigation, simply who's still alive at that time, they are part of his family. The interesting thing is, if you imagine when a pen cenedl dies and his son takes over, that means that the pen cenedl moves down simply 1 generation, but it also means if you go and count back 10, that moves down 1 as well. And the very curious thing is, if you simply look at the implications of basically the fringes of those family trees, it means that every time a penkennital moves to the next generation, simply through, for example, the head dying and his son simply taking over in his place, it means that the fringe element that is not part of the new 10th descent, but was part of the previous one, those fringes actually form a new family in their own right, and their new family head becomes a new penkennital. And so in this context, you can simply see, in going from generation to generation, the family changes slightly, but of course all of these new ones, they all become allied clans because they're coming from the same root, in my case the root of the Harrisons of the North. This also goes and poses an issue on terminology, because it also means that as you get a new penkennital being spun off a line, simply because as it moves down to the new generation, there's one family line generation that's now removed from the current family but is spun up as a new family in their own right, then the problem is, how do you refer to these new family heads? So what you'll have the senior family, in my case the Harrisons of the North, but then you'll have another penkennital, he's also of the Harrisons of the North. So generally the way this happens is that if you just simply go and count back 9 generations, you can then simply determine a location where the family was 9 generations ago, and you can go and simply credit that name. So in my case, although I am the head of the Harrisons of the North worldwide, because we know that 9 generations ago we were at Branthwaite in the west of Cumberland, it means that I can also be called Harrison of the North of Branthwaite. And for example, if a new family tree gets spun off simply because I was simply dying and my heir simply taking over in such a case, then in that circumstance, all that would have to happen is that the new penkennital, he would identify himself as Harrison of the North, but of another location that simply related somehow to that ancestry. And that's just simply a good rule of thumb of how you can simply identify the different branches. And this is not unusual. For those who are familiar with Scots law and Scots heraldry, you'll notice that there was, for example, an aristocrat who was known as the Cock of the North. Now, the interesting thing is, I don't remember the exact year, but I do know it happened by 1157. So I suspect it was 101 years beforehand, and at a time when, of course, Cumberland was simply part of Scotland. But there was a law passed by the king that said heritage that goes from the 3rd generation to the 4th generation becomes indefeasible, heritable property. Now, indefeasible means it can't be destroyed. And heritable, of course, means it simply comes down for generation to generation, and then, of course, it's property. And there's another law that was passed that means that can be bought and sold. And that's actually why you can buy titles in Scotland in the present day. And there's the old saying, no one's as proud as a Scot. Well, that simply comes down for a true Scottish and even British understanding of the fidelity of those laws and the fidelity of the process. Now, the reason why I'm getting into such depth just as an introduction, that goes and shows you a bit about Indigenous Britain. Because this parallel, every single family that's in Cumberland now that is older than 3 generations, they can consider to be Celtic if they have a Celtic affinity. However, of course, to have a family head as a penkennital, you would need 9 generations. And it's not until you achieve the 9th generation that you actually get a penkennital. Now, you can go and call these junior ones who have achieved the family head, you can go and call them a penkennital. What you can't call them, though, is a Lord penkennital. The reason for this is that all 9th generation, that is those who were freemen of the land, they had the right by birthright, the family head had the right by birthright to sit on the regional or national council of Indigenous folk. Now, this is in effect the Indigenous House of Lords for that kingdom, for that region, etc. And in that context, it means that they were not just the lord of their family, that is, all the members of the ninth degree, that part of the family tree. They were also lords by birthright who could sit in the National Council and who could then simply vote on certain topics, with the vote being the resolution of simply all of those who had the right to actually sit there. And in being so, this goes and applies the accredited vote of the actual nation to which they subscribe to. And of course, there are different levels. Of course, above that, there's going to be the prince or the king of the region, depending upon how it plugs into a greater hierarchy. Now, that's all very little bit topsy-turvy or undulating or a little bit foreign to those who don't understand it. But it does go and provide a good infrastructure simply for a workshop on simply, for example, discussing the pathway to become Indigenous in a Celtic nation. And how does one do that? And I've alluded to it without explaining any more detail, that in Celtic law, as evidenced in some of these 10th and 11th century kingdoms, the laws that we know, that we've discovered and which have been previously written down and commented upon, we do know that it took 3 generations to simply naturalise as a Celt. And that goes and gives an indication that somebody today who simply comes, and whether it be a boat person or not, who simply arrives in this nation, it would take 3 generations for them to naturalise as a Celt. So their heirs, their descendants, would be considered to be Indigenous from the 4th generation onwards, assuming they had simply naturalised according to Celtic law. And in that context, that's Indigenous law according to the Indigenous customs and practices of the Celts. So I've gone and painted a nice big picture there, which we're now going to put to one side, because it goes and shows the mechanics of a whole bunch of cogs simply working together. And what I'm going to do is then simply jump across to another circumstance which is familiar to many people, and it relates to simply Jewish. How do you become Jewish? That is, how do you become naturalized as a Jew according to the customs and habits of the Jewish people. And although I'll mention in a moment, this also is going to simply be a topic for a little workshop in this video to be able to expound some of the principles, and from then we'll get on to simply looking at the articles. The articles are where the gold is, and both of these 2 workshops are just illustrations. You don't need to simply accept the minutiae of these things to be able to understand the principles that I'm trying to convey from the actual articles themselves. So what I want to do is just simply pose a situation. Now, the background to me choosing this situation is this. There's a lot of turmoil online where a lot of people, whether through unhappiness or prejudices or simply not understanding, or perhaps being so enamored to, for example, the Palestinian cause, that they prefer the following wouldn't happen. But there's a big conversation that basically is focused around the rights of Eastern European Jews to return to Israel. And of course, there's a focus there on the word return, because if they're of Poland, for example, on what basis are they returning? You know, there's that big question as part of simply the to and fro. The wonderful thing is, the United Nations Declarations on the Rights of Indigenous People goes and clarifies the whole concept there, and in doing so, it gives it great clarity, in particular, Article 33. But rather than talking about the Eastern European Jews, I'm going to talk about an interesting situation. Let's say that in Britain today, there was a person today, as of this very date, who decided that, acknowledging that he wasn't Jewish and that his family had never been Jewish, but for some reason wanted to become Jewish. He may, for example, be thinking of marrying a Jewish girl that is falling in love with, something like that. There are many reasons to naturalise, but let's say he'd made the decision today. So tomorrow he'd approach a rabbi at a synagogue and he'd discuss it through with him, and the rabbi at the synagogue will say, well, yes, there is a pathway to becoming a Jew, and I'll explain it to you. And then he goes and explains it, and then this person decides, I really want to do that, I'll become committed. How do I engage? And the rabbi would give him the particulars, and then he'd engage in the situation. And by the time he gets through, he'd then simply graduate, so to speak. He'd actually become a Jew himself, and from then on he'd be a Jew. And there's a circumstance that simply illustrates somebody naturalising from having not been a Jew to becoming a Jew. And that's quite well known. But the curious thing is, in Judaism, there are also principles that says once you're a Jew, you're a part of the wider Jewish diaspora, and in that context, you're very capable. In fact, you have the birthright under Jewish precepts to be able to simply return to the original Jewish homelands, which of course are in the region that we now call Palestine. And in this concept, I'm not referring to the Palestinian Authority, which many nations are going through the progress of recognising or talking about recognising that. But within the actual region of Palestine, which is basically the whole area, including the East Bank and into Transjordan and Jordan itself, the origin of the indigenous Jews is accredited by world powers to having simply originated there. And also, of course, there are other people who also have the same claims. The Druze, for example, they're an indigenous group that also have indigenous roots in the same region. And there are also Arabs that have indigenous roots in the same region. And let's not forget that although we go and talk about the Jews being Semitic, therefore to have prejudice against the Jews is anti-Semitic, the Arabs are also a Semitic race. So to be prejudiced against an Arab is also to be anti-Semitic. If you're prejudiced against an Arab, you're anti-Semitic. If you're prejudiced against a Jew, you're anti-Semitic. And that goes and simply raises some questions of whether you're talking about Jews or whether you're talking about Arabs. When discussing their indigenous rights, it's the right of the indigenous people themselves, according to their customs and traditions, to actually go and simply, from that, extrude principles, practices, and make decisions according to the nature of how their elders simply go and arrange themselves. And therefore, the voice of the people can simply say, these are the precepts that we do this, because of this, that happens. And it's for nobody outside that indigenous race, whether that be Arabic, whether that be the Jewish people. It's for the people who are indigenous to extol that. So the question is, if you're not a part of the indigenous race or peoples in question, and yet you are arguing against them and putting down their indigenous precepts, the question is, are you being racist? Well, the answer is yes. And for many people, that can be a surprise. I remember once, my first time I realised that I'd been racist, and then I think, well, was I really being racist? But I'm about to tell you the story, and it's a bit topsy-turvy. So I happened to be, as a contractor, simply going from hotel to hotel as I did different software contracts. I've been a software engineer for 22 plus years, and in that I've had many different regional contracts where I'd simply go on site, stay in a hotel. And I was staying in a hotel, and naturally I'm gregarious, I'll talk till the sun goes down, I like talking to people. And I was having a good old chat to this person who I'd recently known for maybe weeks, and we're having a good old chat in the kitchen. And this is where we had the meals, I should say, the dining room, but it was breakfast. And in having a good old chat, he started asking me about myself, and of course you start simply conveying things. And I said, oh, I was a missionary for marginally under 7 years. And he, looked a bit surprised. So I softened it. I just simply said, oh, I wasn't a missionary in deepest, darkest Africa. I was doing urban mission. So I was the one who used to go and find kids who had run away from home and things like that. It was urban mission. It wasn't in another country. And terminology within the church itself. When you're in these areas, you're identified as a missionary, you're an urban missionary, and that was it. But the thing that I realised, having said, oh, this wasn't in deepest, darkest Africa, I realised I was talking to somebody who was as black as the ace of spades. He had African heritage. And by saying darkest Africa, I had simply put a cover over some of the light of his Indigenous background. And in retrospect, I don't think it was good, and I've since apologised for doing that. I actually apologised at the moment because it suddenly became a curious topic, and then we started discussing things down that line, which became quite amusing. And I won't go into the rest of the conversation because that's a story for another day. So it's not unusual for people to accidentally or inadvertently be racist, and it's just a part of simply growing in one's life. And the reason why we should simply recognise this is because in these conversations it is easy for people to be involved in a conversation and have a precept and simply put down something that relates to an Indigenous precept where the Indigenous peoples themselves have the vested right to actually make some determinations, and not you, if it's okay according to them and it's actually a part of their characteristics or traditions or culture. For you to go and put that down is racist, and you may be putting it down in a context where you don't realise that you're being racist. And if you suddenly became known, you'd think, just like I did, oh golly, I'm so sorry that I said that. And because that happens quite a lot, and particularly I find this online, where basically people are loggerheads over different issues, it's quite often that I actually have to bring up with another person that their perspective is racist. And it's very, very important there not to attack them as being racist, but just simply to raise it to them that that perspective could be seen as racist, because always give people a way out if you can, unless they really want to press the point. And even before going into that, it's quite important to develop some sort of discussion and respect as the conversation builds, so that when you get to the point of simply saying, oh, by the way, don't you think that because of Article 33 of the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People, don't you think that that is perhaps racist? You know, do we need to do a deep dive here? What do you think? Because I think quite strongly that if you were to progress on that path, it would be racist, but not so much at the level that we're discussing now. And I've used more words than I generally would. I'm basically just trying to give a few phrases that simply would help people to, in one way or another, start formulating and considering things as one discusses. One of the advantages of doing TikTok videos and simply doing commentary is that you're building up your debating skills. So for me, it's quite a great pastime. I do a lot of time on TikTok debating in the comments, or once I've simply formulated a view, simply doing a quick video on the same thing. And quite often it's actually easier and quicker to simply do a 10-minute video, particularly when someone like me has got the gift of the gab and is simply happy elocuting and going on and on and on to the point of boring you to death. But in this context, of course, I'm trying to find my own audience, and not so much audience, but community where people are also giving back. I've got quite a niche here in this context. And in this context, it's important for me to continue. I've written 22 books on the nature of Indigenous Britain, a lot about Arthurian Britain, and a lot in particular is simply around the actual focus area, the interfaith community of Christians, Jews and Muslims and Indigenous people in an interfaith context in Britain. In the same context that King Charles recently had an interfaith summit at Buckingham Palace. So look, moving along, I've now gone and given two circumstances where in one context there are Indigenous people in Britain, and at the most basic level, if an immigrant comes into Britain, they may want to simply naturalise in there. At the higher level, I've gone and shown you that according to the Indigenous laws or the Indigenous traditions of Britain, that there are people who, by birthright, who exist today, there have got to be hundreds of thousands of Lord-penned candles right across this land, if only they knew that was they. And if these people simply, within their local areas, form an Indigenous council, the reality is that so long as they're conforming to Arthurian canon, which is a subject I'll relate later on, so long as they're actually doing that or conforming to Indigenous law, it means that they are then in a position where by voting they can start simply illustrating or projecting the Indigenous voice of the community of which they are part of. It's a fiduciary legal position, and it's something that ordinary Anglo-Saxon or Scottish or Welsh councils would have to take into account, because they're just simply the speaker of these councils, of each of these councils, will just simply be a accredited fiduciary Indigenous spokesperson of that Indigenous community. They're basically Indigenous leaders in that context. So, right, there's all of that. And remembering there's that superstructure, we want to talk about the pathway into the Indigenous community for someone who's an outsider, who's someone who wants to naturalise in there. We've also had a look at just simply a broad overview of somebody wanting to become a Jew and then having gone through the process being a Jew, but then also being part of the worldwide diaspora of Jews, having the right to return to Israel, shall we say, the region of Palestine, shall we say. Because I don't want to get into the politics, we can dig deeper into the politics once we have a good understanding of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. So now I'm going to have a look at Article 33. Now, there are other articles of the 46 articles of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People that do have very close bearing to this Article 33 in the context that we're wanting to discuss. Of course, you can go and simply create a spectrum of discussion topics right across the spectrum of Indigenous politics, shall we say, and for any particular one, you will go and assemble of those 46 a collection of articles that are most relevant to that. And depending upon the actual position or the subject, the actual collection of those articles is going to be different. However, in the concept of simply naturalising, the path to naturalise as an Indigenous Briton, or sorry, I beg your pardon, let's be more generic, the pathway to simply naturalise as a part of any Indigenous community relates primarily to Article 33, but also has to do with Article 3, Article 5, Article 9 and Article 46, in particular paragraph 2. Now, Article 46, paragraph 2 probably has to do with all of them, and that is because the way the United Nations have gone and framed the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People, because the United Nations consists of member states, the paragraph 2 of Article 46 just simply goes and says that these articles in whole are not designed to dismember, for example, any particular nation state that's subscribed to the United Nations. And I'm going to read out, first of all, Article 33, because that needs to dip your toe and give you a bit of excitement as to where we're going. But then I'm just simply going to read out Article 46, paragraph 2, and very briefly discuss that, just to show that we're not undermining any current nation state that's actually signed up to the United Nations. What we're doing is simply cradling and enhancing the rights of Indigenous people within the context of the nation state that they subsist in, or across the diaspora of nation states that they subsist in. So first of all, Article 33, and it's this: Indigenous peoples have the right to determine their own identity or membership in accordance with their customs and traditions. So let's expound this a bit further. It starts off, Indigenous peoples have the right to determine. Now, without going into the rest, that goes and says that Indigenous peoples have the right of determination vested in themselves. It is not invested in any external body. This means that no external body can simply go and compel the Indigenous peoples to go and change their laws, their customs or practices. The right of determination about these is vested in the Indigenous peoples themselves. So that's actually a very, very good safeguard. It's a golden shield, and I know it's invisible, but here I'm holding a golden shield in front of me. It's the golden shield that simply goes and protects the Indigenous people from manipulation from the outside. So let's simply read on from that. So just reflecting, Indigenous peoples have the right to determine their own identity. Now look, I'm an Indigenous Celt of Cumberland. I identify as an Orthodox Celt. So I have the right as an Indigenous member of the county of Cumberland, going way back to time immemorial, I have the right to determine my own identity. And of course, as part of the wider collection of Lord Penkenedals that have the right to sit in council and vote on these things as well, there is a wider right that's also embedded within that. So let's expound it. I'm going to simply recursively repeat the whole sentence and then add the new part. So Indigenous peoples have the right to determine their own identity or membership. So if the right to determining the membership is vested in the Indigenous community itself, that means, for a start, that outside people, for example, outside nations, have no right to simply go and compel them to qualify membership or even discount or discontinue membership. It's up to the Indigenous the Indigenous peoples themselves to make this determination. It means, for example, in the United Kingdom, Parliament has no right to prevail over the Indigenous Celts of this land with respect to their Indigenous Celtic traditions. There is no right there. And in that context, one wonders, what rights does the king have? Well, this is another story, because as it turns out in Cumberland, King Charles would be the king of this nation anyway, and I've written books upon this that go and extol the reasons why. But the essence is, in the year 638 AD, there was a dynastic marriage between the last Indigenous queen of the Kingdom of Reged and a Northumbrian prince called Oswy, who happened to become the 7th Anglo-Saxon High King, which went and allied the Kingdom of Reged to the office of the Anglo-Saxon High King, which then simply passed down through the ages and up to today. So technically, King Charles is the king of the Kingdom of Reged, king of the Kingdom of the County of Cumberland. However you want to express that, loose terms for now, without getting into the minutiae, will simply work for the sake of the demonstration. But it is interesting because in that context, although Parliament doesn't have any rights to compel the actual Indigenous peoples of this illustration to change their views of membership or even identity, because the king becomes part of that Indigenous nation by his birthright, then he actually has an opportunity of being one of those who simply influences the vote, and indeed he actually becomes one of the Lord Penkenedals himself of that council, whether he sits in the council or not. The matter that he prevails over it is quite interesting, but fundamentally he's actually part of the council. So there's a curious thing there. But this is just simply a side issue as relates to Indigenous politics in the United Kingdom, or shall we say in Indigenous Britain, which subsists below the foreign veneers that have been laid over the Indigenous people, which manifest as the United Kingdom. So let's go and simply do another recursive roll over Article 33 and add the next part. And this goes and comes to the conclusion. Indigenous peoples have the right to determine their own identity or membership in accordance with their customs and traditions. So these customs and traditions, these are the ones that I have been effectively referring to or inferring, implying in this whole conversation. So those customs and traditions, they're the ones that are inferred by the Indigenous people themselves. Now, the curious thing is, by the time you go, for example, if someone was to do a dissertation at a university studying the Indigenous peoples, and there may be a whole bunch of arguments here and there may be a whole bunch of arguments there, and of course the person can go and do something that's conclusive, they can go and submit the dissertation, and by the time it's peer reviewed, it may be that the peer review goes and rubber stamps it and says yes. The thing is though, there may be some difference in what the actual Indigenous community goes and says. Because the right of determination is up to the Indigenous community, the question is, how does the Indigenous community go and trump, for example, what has been peer reviewed by the university and the academic scholars? Now, I'm not pitting one war against the other. I'm simply throwing this in because it goes and illustrates actually the eventual outcome, but it would also influence universities discussing these things in peer reviews to simply rephrase perhaps their comments and the commentary that is part of their peer review, but in doing so it would also influence the actual people writing the dissertations themselves to be more careful in their expression so that it was received in a context that wouldn't be dismissed by the actual, or is less likely to be dismissed by the actual Indigenous community themselves. But the question is, in an Indigenous community, there may be a whole bunch of Indigenous people. Let's consider them all freelancers because they haven't got together a specified structure. At some stage it might become, oh, this person has that opinion and this person has that opinion and this person has that opinion. How do you resolve that so that you get a voice of the Indigenous community that then reflects back to be compared against the dissertation that's being peer reviewed, so that you can look at the original dissertation and also the comments by those that peer reviewed and in essence resolve the differences between the Indigenous voice and those other voices. And this comes down to why I've gone and simply mentioned the Lord Penkenedal status in not just the county of Cumberland, but this goes and covers the whole of Indigenous Britain. It means that because we know that the customs and traditions of the Brythonic peoples were that each Penkenedal had the right to sit in a national council, it means that all of the Indigenous family heads sitting in that council as Lord Penkenedals, it means that they can go and discuss the issue and they can vote on it, vote on the wording, and it's that wording that the Indigenous Council goes and says this is the truth, and that means that where the academic peer review conflicts with it, it means that those have to be resolved in the favour of the voice, the birthright council's voice that they've democratically voted upon, that being their way, that being their customs and traditions. So I've been a little bit gentle in how I've expressed that, because I can also visualize circumstances where different perspectives expressed from a separate perspective can actually sound contrary but actually not be so. The reason for this is that Brythonic communication works different to the ordinary Western world method of communication. Brythonic communication in Welsh terms is typically defined or extolled or influenced by a subject called awen, A-W-E-N, and that means muse or inspiration. But it's actually much deeper than that. Awen relates to the expressions of the bards, and so if you go and simply make an expression of awen as an Indigenous person in the modern day, so long as your expression conforms to, for example, Arthurian canon and the ilk of that, it means that your expression is as if connected to the bards of the 6th century. And the wonderful thing about the Brythonic communication is that Brythonic communication is generally expressed so that it's compactly packaged to pass from generation to generation. And in that context, then you'll discover in examining the tenets of it and the characteristics of Brythonic communication that it differs wildly from typical Western expressions and, shall we say, typical English expressions. And I'll just give you a quick example. So in the sense of Awan, there are 3 characteristics that you can basically understand Awan to conform to, and in that sense this triangle can be called a triptych, and each side represents something separate. And although these things are basically what the information is packaged in, it is the center of the triangle which is the ideal that's communicated. Now I'm going to give you a specific example to illustrate this. Now I call this the triptych of Awan. So that's a triptych, there being 3, and of course of Awan. And this is a term, a label that I've actually coined myself in my own writings. That wasn't a term that exists. But what is clear though, if you study Brythonic communication, you will find that by large everything can be attributed to these 3 different triangles all converging on a certain spot, these 3 sides of the triangle and the equilateral triangle converging on a center spot. So the first of them is what we call a kenning, the second is a circumlocution, and the third is cipher. Now we of course in the Western world, but also in the Brythonic world, once they started writing things down, tend to simply write from left to right. So depending upon your video screen, this is the left and this is the right. So in this context, we have from the left, we have the kenning rising from the angle that actually connects with the cipher. So the foundation of these other 2, where one rises to an apex from the actual cipher, at the apex, the second one falls back to the actual very same cipher. And this is quite clever. So this one is called kenning, this one is called circumlocution, and this one is called, the base is called cipher. Now a kenning is an Old Norse word that simply means a compound noun. And rather than giving you the Old Norse expression, I'll just give you the English translation. So there's an Old Norse kenning that translates as whale road, whale-road. It's a compound noun. The whale, of course, is the big fish, and the road is a path to a destination, whale road. And what that would mean would depend upon basically the circumlocution, how you would infer it. But we know from Old Norse poetry and writings that whale road meant sea. And for example, at the front of my place, there's a vehicle road. There don't have to be vehicles on that road for it to be realised that that's a thoroughfare. By the same token, there doesn't have to be a whale or a road to be visually present for you to realise that whale road symbolically means sea. So that goes in a very cute way, goes and illustrates what a kenning is. Now what I want to do is jump to a Welsh kenning, because this is where the whole triptych is easiest to communicate, and that's because the Welsh kenning relates to real-to-life Brythonic communication that's passed down from generation to generation. So here we go in this context, this new kenning. I won't give you the Welsh, but I will give you the English translation. So the English translation is eagle of the mountain. There's a compound noun. And in very short, you could say eagle mountain, but eagle of the mountain is the English translation. That's the inference. So as a kenning, that's the first part of the triangle, rising from the left, where it's connected to the cipher, and the cipher has a secret key, which actually comes into it when we talk about the circumlocution. Of course, in going from kenning up to the apex, we've risen to the height of simply knowing that the expression here is eagle of the mountain. However, how we infer that eagle of the mountain has to simply fall as a part of this circumlocution, and this falls back down to the cipher. So therefore, the interpretation of the cipher itself, the cipher key, allows us to infer the actual meaning. And this is where brythonic communication becomes very, very special. Now, we know from Caesar and other sources that our ancient Celtic ancestors were oral. In that sense, you'll find that the bodies of the Druids, they were the repositories of the knowledge of all mankind. Information simply flowed up out of the vessel and overflowed as though a fountain. And that's quite a visual illustration of what a vessel of the human spirit, the Celtic spirit, relates to. So in that sense, one will realize that in communication, for example, in public, let's say we were at a ancient brythonic gathering. It could be a festival, it could be anything, it could be a village, it could be a town, it could be anywhere in the country, it could be somewhere in Wales, deepest darkest Wales, you're allowed to say deepest darkest Wales, or it could be somewhere in Scotland around the Eildon Hills or somewhere like that where there were known to be big festivals. It could be down in Cornwall where there is a very great ancient tradition of ancient Britons there. It could even be in Brittany. It may be anywhere, funnily enough, anywhere in England where, despite the Anglo-Saxons coming and laying themselves as a veneer over the indigenous Celts, that there were still collections of indigenous Celts who continued with their traditions. So in this setting, we're assuming that there's a whole community of indigenous Celts who by large know each other. But there are also going to be visitors to the festival who are from the outside. And visitors typically won't know the secret cipher. But of course the local people there will. So in this context, when, let's say, there's a town crier or somebody that goes and orally goes and declares the news of the day, when the town crier or the oral repository, the druid speaking to the people, goes and simply conveys a message to the people, when he goes and says these words, eagle of the mountain, something very curious happens on this circumlocution. Now, the background to circumlocution is a roundabout way of saying things. In this context, the funny thing, and this is a very solid characteristic of brythonic communication, it's up to the listener to infer the meaning. It's not up to the speaker to infer the meaning. Now, that's quite a big characteristic, and that's quite a reversal of what we're used to. We're used to, in the Western world, particularly in the English language, of simply the speaker trying to be definitive and simply inferring exactly what they wanted to do, but not in the brythonic world. The brythonic person would simply go and utter, for example, a kenning within a complete oral explanation of whatever was being expressed at the time, where there would be many of these triptychs relating to these individual compound nouns and how they interrelated to each other with different parts of the story. But the simple matter is, in brythonic world, the speaker goes and articulates what is communicating, but it's actually the listener who infers the meaning. So how does this happen? So let's go back to our kenning. We've risen from the cipher, and there is a secret key that I haven't told you about. So I haven't yet told you what the secret key is. However, and that relates to, for example, the people in this general community who are from the outside. They're not going to have the secret key. So that's why it's quite curious to start off with. So in not mentioning the secret key, the outcome of the circumlocution is going to be the result of the listeners who are from another area, who are from not from this local area, they don't have the secret key. So when they hear the phrase eagle of the mountain, they're going to visualize an eagle up flying in majestic nature over the mountain. They're flying over the vales and the peaks and through the mist and across the trees and being caught in the sunlight as it dazzled through. There's going to be that wonderful image of an eagle of the mountain. And of course, here this circumlocution is falling down to intersect with the same cipher, that is the base of the same equilateral triangle. However, as that circumlocution intersects the cipher, of course, there are going to be those in the local community who do know what the secret key is. So I'm going to tell you the secret key that they would already know, that the general tourists that have come to the region won't know. The secret key in this case might be that the kenning eagle of the mountain actually identifies a particular lord in the region out of the many lords of the region. So in that sense, you can imagine the bard simply speaking the whole elocution, of which in there's the kenning eagle of the mountain. Those who are unfamiliar with this secret key are going to visualize that the expression refers to an eagle flying over the mountain, and that'll be their visualization. And of course, the bard who's orally presenting this would have made this total composition so that that imagery that was inferred by those who didn't know the secret key actually fitted in and took its own living context within the actual oral repository. So those, however, who heard eagle of the mountain, who had the secret key, who knew that it related to a lord, they'd actually visualize that lord, whether it be on his horse, whether it be in his mansion, whether it be simply him fighting a battle, or simply talking or leading or training his soldiers. The most magnificent thing is they would have all had an experience and understood that context. So within this whole exposition, this elocution that's been presented by the bard in this token circumstance, where there is a big story, there's an overflow of information that's simply risen from the bard's oral repository of his body and overflowed like a mountain. In that context, they've heard many, many, many kennings that relate to circumlocutions that each relate to a secret cipher or not, depending upon who's listening to it. So this is how Brythonic communication works, and the extraordinary thing is, this is an indigenous nature of how the Britons, the Brythons, communicate. And in this context, if there was an issue in front of the king that simply related to, for example, a law case that involved foreigners, it would be up to the Lord Penkenedals in conference with the king to say, although they heard that, this was actually the truth. This was actually the fiduciary concept that had been communicated to all of our local peoples. So there's an example that simply goes and shows a lot of the intricacies. So look, so far I've gone and spoken about the nature of Brythonic communication, but what I'll just simply want to do is just do a little bit of a summary and say the following. I've gone and basically conveyed a picture how in, for example, the county of Cumberland or anywhere in Indigenous Britain, but this could be just simply somewhere else worldwide. And just to go and illustrate that it could be anywhere, it's really important to realise that although I'm talking about Indigenous Britain and therefore Celtic Indigenous Britain, and in that context I'm not talking about Goidelic Indigenous Ireland, talking about Brythonic Indigenous Britain, the matter that within the Celtic Triangle there are 30 countries that have known Celtic roots means that what I've just spoken about could be applied to any of these 30 countries, because they too have the same indigenous heritage as relates to this structure where there are Lord Penkenedals who each have the birthright to simply sit on a national council based upon them having 9 generations going back to that 10-generation common heir. And you may find that in some of them it might be 5 generations or 8 generations or 10 or 12, but in the absence of that the default is to assume 9. So what is the Celtic Triangle? Well, the Celtic Triangle, very, very curiously, goes from the north of Great Britain, it goes then down to the south of Portugal, and then it goes across to the centre of Turkey, which is Anatolia, and which is where the Galatians in the book of Galatians came from, because they were Celts, and then it goes back to the north of Britain. And within that area there are 30 countries that have Celtic roots, and 30 countries which could, if there was a Celtic revival in each country, the Pencanidals, the family heads, who are, say, 9th generation family heads, they could get themselves into a council, and in doing so they could then vote, and they would then be the voice of the people in a revived Celtic Renaissance. And in that sense, what support do they have? Well, they have the 46 articles of the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People. So this means that in any of these countries, let's go and pick any of them. Let's go and say, let's go and say Slovenia. If Slovenia had Celtic roots, which I understand that it does, and there was a Renaissance, a small Celtic Renaissance in Slovenia, within which people could prove 9 generations and a Celtic affinity, and then form themselves into a council of those family heads, it would mean that not only would the United Nations articles recognise their right to be so, for example, their right to determine their own identity, but also the right to determine their own membership, but we Indigenous Celts of Britain would actually recognise the same thing, because we're undertaking the same rights and the same identity. And in this sense, there will probably need to be a visitation of the different areas. And it's curious that Caesar noted that it seems that the Druids originated in Britain, and all the other Celtic countries basically went to see the Druids of Britain for their instruction. And I would say that if there was a Celtic Renaissance in Britain, it means that in the first instance there'd be the revived Pencanidals and local family or national councils here within Britain, but then we'd be training our people up, whether they be going to university to get doctorates, to have specialists who basically became the accredited voice of the actual council to say, yes, this is the doctrine. We'd actually have modern day Druids forming out of that, of which then, as there were renaissances in each of the other countries in the Celtic Triangle, they could then simply send their representatives across here, undertake all of the doctrine here, and then go back. And the curious thing is, something magical is happening here. Let's say, look, that spread to every single one of the countries of the Celtic Triangle. There's one that actually doesn't have Celtic roots that I know, but I'm just going to leave that. That seems to be Andorra, but I don't quite know. Anyway, so within that perspective, let's say that there's a Renaissance in Britain. All of the other 30 Celtic countries basically had a Renaissance. They start just simply... I'm searching for a term which I can't quite find, but they basically biologically went and formed automatically. They were self-forming into their regional councils, and then having done so, they went to Britain and came back, and there was this cross-flow, like Caesar implies happened in ancient Britain with the Druids here. Not only would that be a situation that simply would be very much representative of what happened here in ancient days, so therefore it would be in continuance of those ancient customs and traditions. But the curious thing is, we know that each of these countries, there's Albania, there's Kosovo, there's North Macedonia, there's Slovakia, there's, did I say Kosovo? There are those different areas there, and we can go back and we can include all the big boys, and there's Poland, and there's Germany, and there's France, and there's Austria, and all these other places, Spain, Portugal, the north of Italy, that all had Celtic areas, but fundamentally in this modern day, although there are indigenous Celts there, the simple matter is they each have their own identity. The United Kingdom, people worldwide tend to think English, and of course then suddenly people find, oh, Scotland, and then they think Wales, but fundamentally there's this great Anglo-Saxon thing that relates to the English thing that relates to the United Kingdom. Germany is the Germans, you're not thinking Celts. Poland is the Polish, you're not thinking Celts. The Ukraine is the Ukraine, you're not thinking Celts. Kosovo, you're not thinking Celts. And North Macedonia, you're not thinking Celts. And so it goes on. Turkey, you're not thinking Celts, unless you know about the Galatians. And in that context, there is profound nationalism in each area. But imagine if there was a Celtic Renaissance where suddenly everybody was unified by common Celticity. In that context, we'd have a reproduction of what happened in ancient days, not just when Caesar went and simply told us about these things, but when Celticity originally started. Now, the most modern, perhaps most prolific and widely supported view of where the Celts came from is that they originated on the Atlantic seaboard. So this is the west coast, this is the western coast of Spain in particular, and also Portugal, but also the western coast of France as well. And we basically surmise, and this comes from a doctrine that was originally proposed by the dignified, the esteemed Professor Barry Cunliffe and the esteemed Professor John Cox. So if you're searching for this, this is basically called Celts from the West, or Celtic from the West, and the names associated with are Cunliffe and Koch, K-O-C-H, Cunliffe, C-U-N-L-I-F-F-E. And here the presumption is not that the Celts originated in the Atlantic seaboard and then went and invaded all these other places or somehow migrated these other places. Although there will have been general limited migration simply because it's how trade routes worked, but basically the principle is more so that Celticity itself started on the Atlantic seaboard, and as the trade routes spread out and people with Celticity went somewhere else, the Celtic principles were the ones that actually spread. At some stage, Celticity arrived in Ireland and Great Britain and the Isles, but not as an invasion or as a migration of ancient Celts, although some along the trade routes would have stayed. To say that Celticity arrived here means that the principles arrived here and we adopted them. And so that goes and explains very much that somehow people in different regions found reason to accept the common Celticity, irrespective of the indigenous origins of perhaps a disparate people. The nice thing about this is that we can go and simply relate this to this proposition that perhaps if there was an indigenous revival here in Britain, that the first manifestation of that would simply be that in Great Britain there was a Brythonic revival. Now this is where Northern Ireland comes into it, because if there's a Celtic revival in Ayr, that is Ireland, but the whole island of Ireland, that is Ayr. Oh golly, I wasn't even playing tautological emphases there. They were all different words. The simple matter is that in Northern Ireland, the underlying indigenous layer that has foreign veneers laid over it, the foreign veneers that have been laid over the Goidelic Celts in Northern Ireland have been, Scottish has been laid over and English has been laid over, but also Brythonic Celts have been laid over them. So let's assume that in this Celtic revival that the foreign veneers started to be peeling back. All over Great Britain, the English veneers will be peeled back, the Scottish veneers will be peeled back, because of course the Scotty were colonisers. The Scotty came from Ireland and colonised the north, and in doing so the Scotty are actually a foreign veneer over the layer of the peoples of what we now call Scotland, so they will be peeled back. But let's just simply consider that in Northern Ireland you go and peel back the English, you go and peel back the Scottish, but then you'd find Celtic Brythonic indigenous, a Celtic Brythonic indigenous veneer laid over the Goidelic, and that would have to be peeled away anyway. Now, another way of expressing that is that the Brythonic Celts of Britain don't have any authority to prevail over the Goidelic Celts of Ireland. And in that sense, it would be inevitable in a full-blown Celtic revival of Ireland and also Britain, simply for Northern Ireland to be yielded back to what is now the Republic of Ireland. And you may even find that the Republic of Ireland may actually peel some veneers off itself. For example, its current constitution is in effect an Anglo-Saxon type of constitution, and if you go and peel back the nature of Indigenous Ireland, you'll find that Indigenous Irish law is actually different to the way it's being run now. But I would say that's up to the Irish. I'm not proposing that. I'm just simply saying that I should think that in some degree there are certain inevitabilities of the things that people will examine and question whether they should peel them back and in what time period as well. But basically, by the time we go and get Britain having a Celtic Renaissance, a Celtic revival, a Brythonic Celtic revival, and then we have Ireland doing the same, let's just go and imagine that we've gone and peeled off all of the legalism that relates to the modern day. If you just end up with Indigenous, we still want to have our wonderful relationships. And so that means that we need to recognise the Brythonic underlying Indigenous nature, the nationality of that, and in Ireland, the nationality of that. And in doing so, continue to have agreements between each other so that all the wonderful things like trade and people and all of those things simply continue to happen. And the way that you keep your own nationality, but join in a relationship, in effect, you're creating a Celtic Confederation. So the wonderful thing here is that if Britain and Ireland were to have a Celtic Confederation created, and excuse me, we were smart enough to do it so that all of these things were generic, that means these other countries of the Celtic Triangle could then simply slowly start deciding, shall we join the Celtic Confederation? And of course the feedback will actually affect what's going on in the Celtic Confederation, and ultimately some will join, and as they join and the Confederation gets larger, depending upon the order of who joins, then there's going to be simply evidence of this winding road to Camelot. The Celtic Confederation, the Camelot is in the far distance, and each country of course starts in its own position, and it's a winding road that they will travel to get to simply Camelot. And it's almost the same as if we created a model Indigenous manifesto in Britain for the 2029 election and created that so that it was written so it would be favourable to each of the political parties, whether they be on the left or on the right or betwixt. You could simply plug and play that Indigenous manifesto into any of the political parties, and they would all have the common view of the final destination being Camelot. But as to the widening road that they would choose to get there, they may be all different. Their starting point is where they are on their part of the spectrum from left to right and betwixt. So there's an illustration there. And so in that context, of course, as people go and join the Celtic Confederacy, that goes and conflicts with the tenets of the European Union. So this basically goes and projects a slow but progressive and confident dismantling of the European Union as members pulled out and then joined the Celtic Confederacy. Now that would mean then probably the first nation to leave with respect to this, because of course there are the unhappy Poland and Hungary and different parts in the east of Europe there who are very dissatisfied with their sovereignty being abused as they perceive it. However, over here in Britain, as relates to simply being able to have a renaissance here and a renaissance in Ireland, that renaissance in Ireland, to be able to form that Celtic Confederation, the Good Friday Agreement is going to be dissolved on the basis that Ireland gets the north of Ireland back, but also that there is a Celtic Confederation that's simply created, that both of them join, to which degree they have not just the same benefits they're enjoying now, but also the wondrous opportunities that they have simply by both being as a part of a Celtic Confederacy. And that would fundamentally mean that in that context, Ireland's going to jump out of the European Union first, so that this Celtic Confederacy can be created properly and be a model Celtic Confederacy for the rest to join. And that would chart basically the slow, the progressive, but also the confident dismantling of the European Union as each country in time decided to go and join the Celtic Confederacy. And that would be an amazing situation, because in that context, just like Churchill said, the farther you can look back, the farther forward you are more likely to see, that's my paraphrase, that would mean then that in that context, each of them is looking back to their indigenous roots. We can all trace our indigenous roots back to the melt of the last ice age and start looking at all the peoples that have simply come down from all those thousands of years ago to the present day. Now this comes back to Article 33. I'm going to go and build you a beautiful picture that relates to the melt of the last ice age and the peoples that we know were in Britain then, but then simply now still continue. That line has a fiduciary line, and somehow all of these false assumptions that the Beaker people were an ethnic people that came and simply invaded the place and swapped out all of our DNA and things like that, all of those falsities, we can suddenly realise that Article 33 goes and gives us a solid picture of how we can, with confidence, have fidelity by saying there are people in this isle at the melt of the last ice age, and in fact there were people here at 33,000 BC, which I mentioned from Britain, but with respect to the whole conversation about the whole of Europe in the Celtic Triangle, I'm simply going to refer to the melt of the last ice age as a generic story. So in this context, it means that we know that there were people in Britain, for example. We know they are actually in Britain because if you go to about 9,000 BC, one of the most important the most important Mesolithic sites in mainland Great Britain, which we know under the name of Star-Car, S-T-A-R-C-A-R-R, 2 words. That was the first evidence of carpentry in the whole of Europe. This is a very, very important site. That's about 9,000 BC. And so we know that we had these people then. So the question is, as these people descended, how is it that we can confidently say that the fidelity of these people comes all the way through to today? It's the same as saying, I look back all the way through. How can I simply look past, for example, the Beaker people coming into the country and not be confused by that, and simply saying, well, no, we go back. The Beaker people were joining the existing people. They were naturalising into the indigenous people. That's the key. And then simply follow that all the way back. So Article 33 tells us how to do this, because we as an indigenous people, we have the right to determine our own identity. We can simply go and surmise that there were people in Britain 9,000 BC, further back even to 33,000 BC, and in that context, these people simply descended and others joined them. And those who joined them joined the existing people. And so they naturalised into the existing people despite bringing contributions to them. And as they went down, more people arrived making contributions, but they naturalised into the existing people. This is what Article 33 is all about. Indigenous peoples have the right to determine their own identity or membership in accordance with their customs and traditions. We keep going down, people arrived and they naturalised into the existing people. Now, some of that discussion I have heard and do know there is a lot of conversation that can be argued on the minutiae. Let's just simply put that to one side, because I actually accommodate that and I can get through that without any problems. So perhaps discussing that minutiae is for another video. But I have gone and recorded that in a book called The Ascent of Arthurian Britain, and that's available on Amazon Books. And the great thing about that is that it just simply goes and gives a synopsis of that happening. And I'm going to show you why it's actually so important. And although I'm using this as a metaphor to simply really, I want to talk about the whole of Europe in one way or another, descending from the melt of the last ice age to where they are now. The truth is that there were people in most of Europe in one place or another that simply have descended down through the ages, and other people came in, but basically on the indigenous sense they were joined by others. And I know there were great migrations and things, we've got to accommodate that, but the simple matter is, by and large, indigenous peoples can simply continue to keep their self-identity. So the Celts in any country that has been in mainland Europe, you can simply say, well, they were indigenous there, and of course they adopted the practice of Celticity, and that is why they are interesting to we Celts of Britain, because if there is a Celtic Renaissance in that country, because they're having a Renaissance in relation to the indigenous Celtic precepts, there is a familiarity and there is the capability of simply them joining us in a Celtic Confederation. So I had wanted to discuss the descent from the last ice age. So I'm going to simply ask you an indigenous question, and can you come up with the answer? You may need to pause the video and think about it for a while. In what year was Britain born? What is the year that Britain was birthed? This is a very interesting question. So pause now, but otherwise I'm going to tell you the following year. You've got 5 seconds, because if you don't simply pause, you will hear the year 6170 BC. Now, that's peculiar. Who goes and says that? The simple matter is, prior to the year 6170 BC, going all of the way back, Britain and Ireland together were just simply another panhandle of northwestern Europe. Many people will be familiar with the name Doggerland, and the name Doggerland basically relates to the North Sea, the water there having been so much lower the closer it got back to the last ice age, because in the lower it got, the more land was above the surface, and by large, most of the North Sea, other than around the coast of Norway, which is called the Norwegian Trench, most of that in the North Sea was simply above ground. And so at that point in time, there was no English Channel as we know it going all of the way through to on the western side, what we call the English Channel. There were some parts basically forming there as a valley. But the curious thing is, let's go back to the west of Wales 33,000 years ago. So this is basically 31,000 BC, give or take, a little bit of change. And there's a Red Prince of Paverland, a tomb known amongst we indigenous Celt as the Red Prince of Paverland. Now, if you're searching for him on the internet, you'll find that he's actually called to and referred to by archaeologists as the Red Lady of Paverland, and that's because when he was found, he was accidentally misattributed to the wrong sex. Well, we indigenous people think it's time, knowing that he was a very prominent person within this community and male, So he's now being referred to by we as the Red Prince of Paverland. And there may be others who call him the Red Lord of Paverland or the Red Male of Paverland, but he's definitely not the Red Lady of Paverland. So the curious thing about this is that in 31,000 BC, the funeral rites of this person had red ochre simply as a part of the funerary, and it's quite curious that this colour red comes down now to the red dragon in Wales. And if you didn't know, the indigenous flag of the whole of indigenous Britain is the red dragon on the white background. The reason why Wales has to have a green band at the bottom is because it can't be simply the red dragon on white. It has to be different from the whole of the actual nation of Britain, and so therefore having the green band there goes and differences the meaning of that flag, which is attached to what we now call Wales, from the red dragon on the white background, which applies to the whole of indigenous Britain. Curiously, just on the subject, but simply as a footnote, I guess, is that I used to run the Cumbric Revival Community Forum back in the noughties, and we had a big vote back in those days as to what flags we would apply to the rest of Britain. And there are two that are still very, very focused in my mind, but I'll basically mention the ones that I remember with clarity. So the county of Cumberland, where I am, we went and put a black band replacing the Welsh green band. So there was the white background, the red dragon, and simply the black band at the bottom. So that's the county of Cumberland, but also the kingdom of Reged, because we indigenous peoples believe that the county of Cumberland is the kingdom of Reged in its reduced form, in continuity of itself. And we can go and justify that. And if you go to Pictland up in the north, so that is, where's that? That's from the Antonine Wall northward, that's Pictland, and the Cumbric Revival Community Forum decided that the band at the bottom, instead of the black of the county of Cumberland and the green of Wales, for Pictland that would be orange. Now, of course, if you go down to Cornwall, there was, if my memory is correct, the band at the bottom was yellow, and that means, because we know Brittany simply over the coast in France, northwestern France, is a combination of Cornwall having overflowed, the people of Cornwall having overflowed there in the 6th century, that basically was simply checkered black and yellow. And I don't recall the specific numbers. I think it was simply a 5x2 check of that band at the bottom. And what are we missing? We're missing the south of England. The south of England basically was purple. And so the only region that I haven't mentioned is a region that actually includes the county of Cumberland. It includes the northwest of Wales. If you go and draw a radius of 125 miles from the Henge King Arthur's Round Table, which is located 1.2 miles south of the town of Penrith in the county of Cumberland, then what you have is an approximation of what is known in Arthurian or indigenous history, Brythonic history of Britain, as Ir Hen Ogledd, which is the Old North. And we voted on Woad Blue for that. And so if you see a white flag with a red dragon but a Woad Blue band at the bottom, that's actually the region of Ir Hen Ogledd. And that's 125 miles, that radius, simply from that henge. And that's pretty accurate. In some places it's simply a little bit longer, in some places a little bit further back. For example, if you simply draw it going up to Scotland, it gets to almost Dundee, which is a little bit further out than what it was. If you simply wind round down to Sheffield, for example, the River Sheaf is the south side of the River Sheaf is the border that simply goes out of Hen Ogleth, and the most southerly part of the River Sheaf, as I remember, is about 114 miles. So that's not 125. But of course, if you follow the circle round to the northwest of Wales, it needs to include, because we know this, because it needs to include the Llyn Peninsula, which is the very tip of the northwest of Wales, which goes out to the tip of Bardsey Island. Well, that's marginally greater than 125 miles, because from memory, the 125 miles radius from the Hens there goes round about to Carnarvon. And of course, that needs to be extended. And of course, it goes up past Glasgow in that direction as well. So there's a big circle there. So that goes and illustrates what the Cumbric Revival Community Forum, some of the Indigenous people of this land were discussing back in the noughties. And I used to occasionally be interviewed on BBC Radio Cumbria in relation to that. So there's a big picture there. Now I need to consolidate my thoughts here. So what am I going to do? Okay, I'm going to simply start to tie this up. I'm going to now go back to Article 33 and read it out again, and then I'm simply going to focus on a few points, but then I'm going to look at Articles 3, 5, 9 and Articles 46 paragraph 2. I think what I'll do is actually mention Article 46 paragraph 2 first, because in all of this context and concept of the Indigenous peoples having a renaissance, and this whole discussion that I've had about the possibility of the rise of Celticity and the falling of or the dismantling of the European Union and all of these things, the United Nations is actually quite clear. These precepts in terms of the UN articles actually go and illustrate that these states would have to yield to that. So this goes and shows that there would have to be a peaceful pathway to it. And I'll explain this. So here we are, Article 46, paragraph 2. Nothing in this declaration may be interpreted as implying for any state. So the states are referring to the United Kingdom, Republic of Ireland, Greece, etc., Poland, Germany, France, Italy, Spain, Portugal, etc. And let's not forget Australia, Canada, the United States of America, perhaps Tibet, Nepal and others. Nothing in this declaration may interpret as implying for any state, people, group or person any right to engage in any activity, to perform any act contrary to the Charter of the United Nations. So let's not forget that the composition of the peoples who are signatories of that are these member states. They're not going to write an article that says if you're Indigenous, you can actually trump just simply by fiduciary legal means, you can't simply go and trump the state you're in. And so that simply goes and shows if there's a renaissance, basically the politicians have to, if it's going to go that way, to being a complete, almost like a company takeover, which is a reverse takeover. If the Indigenous people were going to reverse take over the state, as I've implied in this previous Celtic confederacy that could possibly occur, then there needs to be the politicians of the day understanding where the Camelot is, but also negotiating the winding road to Camelot so that that can simply be achieved without there being any loss of economy and things like that on the way to it or towards it. So because all of these countries signed up to the United Nations, this has gone and said, this doesn't go and give the Indigenous peoples the right, this is my paraphrase, to engage in any activity or perform any act contrary to the Charter of the United Nations. So this is point 1, but there's a point 2 here. It doesn't say point 1 or 2, I'm just simply academically dividing it in my mind. There's an or, and then here goes the follows. Or construed as authorising or encouraging any action which would dismember or impair totally or in part the territorial integrity or political unity of sovereign and independent states. So let's go back to the concept of Northern Ireland. This is not saying that that the United Kingdom should be compelled to go and simply give Northern Ireland back to the Republic of Ireland. This is going and saying that these states are prevented specifically from this actually construing that. It doesn't actually say that at all. But what these articles do, it allows, in the context of there being a significant Celtic Renaissance, for each of the states to simply start charting their own passage, a winding road to Camelot, so that in that context the end destination can be achieved, but by devolution of the entire state, or the reverse takeover of the entire state by the indigenous state, and in particular by the indigenous Celtic state, because some of the actual countries will have different indigenous peoples also amongst them, as we know is happening in the Middle East. So the advantage, of course, of discussing the Celtic situation is that because Celticity is basically just simply generic, it means that although all of these countries have come from their different disparate indigenous states, by adopting Celticity, they've adopted a common set of rules that history has proven over thousands of years is so generic, it's just simply a ray of sunshine simply coming from heaven in that context. So I'm just going to read Article 46 again and just simply refresh in our minds that nothing of the declaration of these 46 articles is intended to trump the state and threaten the state. Everything would have to be a negotiated peace and then changed through negotiations. So nothing in this declaration may be interpreted as implying for any state, people, group or person any right to engage in any activity or to perform any act contrary to the Charter of the United Nations, or construed as authorising or encouraging any action which would dismember or impair, totally or in part, the territorial integrity or political unity of any sovereign and independent states. So I think that's quite clear. So right, let's get back to Article 33. So we've discussed the whole Celtic model, the workshop that we've been discussing. We've previously discussed the nature of a Jew naturalising into the Jewish diaspora, but then by their own rights having the right to simply go back to Israel. Not because Israel is a Zionist state, let's move the politics of that to one side, simply because Israel is a state through democratic process has said Jews from the diaspora, by large, have the right to return. And return is in a special context, in the same way that Christians have converts, but Muslims have reverts. And that is another concept that I won't simply discuss here, although to me as a Christian I understand why the Muslims say reverts, and that's because Muslims believe that children are born perfect, so therefore when someone goes and converts to Islam, they actually are returning to or reverting to simply perfection. That's why they're called reverts, not converts. So Article 33 goes and says, Indigenous peoples have the right to determine their own identity. They've got self-determination. Their own identity or membership, their right to naturalise, in accordance with their customs and traditions. So let's go now to simply read through generally Articles 3, 5, 9, and then I'm going to just simply do a slight recap again of Article 33, because this is most important to this masterclass. Now, when reading these other articles, I'm just going to read them. I don't have a lesson plan as to what I want to say with these. I'm just simply going to say things that come to mind as relate to these, as relates to Article 33. I can hear my cat in the background. I hope you can. It's whinging. It's hungry. Right, so Article 3. Indigenous peoples have the right to self-determination. Excuse me, I'm going to go and feed the cat. And the reason why my cat is happy is because of this. You've seen it before. These are, I'm not advertising these, I'm just simply showing you why my cat's being quiet. Okay, Article 3, Indigenous peoples have the right to self-determination. By virtue of that right, they freely determine their political status and freely pursue their economic, social and cultural development. So that means within a nation where they're not conflicting simply with the overall behaviour of the general peaceful conduct of the nation, that they have the rights to freely determine their political status, freely pursue their economic, social and cultural development. This doesn't mean the state needs to give them money, any of these things. This means that where they can simply draw on such resources, they're free to actually do that. It also means, for example, within certain contexts, already people of the United Kingdom have the right for homeschooling. That would mean that the children of Indigenous people would have the right to be schooled at home and within communities of children being schooled at home within a Celtic community neighbourhood. And so there's an interesting way there. So the words I like here are freely. They have the right to self-determination, sure, we've covered that in 33. But also, by virtue of that right, they freely determine their political status and freely pursue their economic, social and cultural development. And in this context, I'm going to go back simply to the notion of there being an Indigenous area. I'm going to use the county of Cumberland as an example because it's well known to me. And I'm going to simply talk about Article 3 in that context. So in the context of Article 3, the curious thing is I know about the 9th, 10th, 11th and 12th century laws that applied to Cumberland. And, oh, hello, pussycat. And in that context, the interesting thing was that we already had democracy in Cumberland in the same way as they already had democracy in Wales. And that's because the Indigenous family heads, the Lord Pencenedals, had the birthright to sit on the National Council and vote as part of the National Council. So that means that each family, every family, had their own, shall we say, Member of Parliament. Because of course, because the Celts were oral, it was a parliament where the parley happened, everything was oral, everything was spoken, and they were a member of that. But in this context, because they're an Indigenous lord, in the context of being a Lord Pencenedal, it's an Indigenous House of Lords. And this is where the rubber hits the road in context of this, because you can imagine how this would apply to the rest of Europe if the rest of Europe did this, because this is a Celtic ideal that people in a Renaissance will be subscribing to. So for somebody coming, an immigrant coming into Cumberland or into Wales or any other Celtic region in the Brythonic area of the British Isles, that is mainland Great Britain and the surrounding isles, when they wanted to naturalise, to simply, so they decided to stay, they wanted to naturalise as an Indigenous Celt, they would do so over 3 generations. So in the 4th generation, at that point, they would then have the right to be called an Indigenous Celt because they would be. Now the curious thing is, until they reach 9 generations, they're not of the 9th degree, they become freemen of the land in the 9th degree. So just for a moment, I'll forget about the 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th and 8th generations. So in those early periods, 1,000 years ago, and a little bit more, a little bit less, and going back a long way, land was not bought and sold by large. The allocation that the freeman, the Lord Pencenedal, got would be sufficient for his whole family. All of the land was simply divided up amongst the Pencenedals, with some of it being left to other purposes, such as, for example, abbeys and the high ground, where during the summer they would simply send their animals up to simply to graze. But by large, if anyone was in the house, it wasn't bought or sold. It's because each Penkenador, each Lord Penkenador was given simply an allocation that simply catered for his whole family, and the Lord Penkenador would then simply go and hand it out. Now, because these Lord Penkenadors had the experience of the previous 9 generations, and then for those that were, in my case, for example, 28 generations, we had much more experience that had been handed down from generation to generation to generation. Basically, if someone was born, because the family was well established, most of the cottages were there, the buildings were there, the farms were there, the different quarries were there, the timber areas were there. So when someone came of age, they'd just been given a new plot of land, or one that had been yielded perhaps by someone that had died without heirs, and that person would move in there for free. So how that relates to the modern age is anybody in Cumberland in a full-blown Celtic revival who had been here for 9 generations or more, they'd be entitled to free land by birthright. And that land, according to the customs and traditions of the Celts, would be large enough so that that family would be self-sustainable within the context of being part of a Celtic community where other families were also living self-sustainable lifestyles. Now, although back in the old days that amount of land was available to be given to each family was larger, in the modern day you can basically use a rule of thumb in Britain simply because of the rainfall and the amount of grass that's grown and how plants grow, and also the forestation and how things tend to work. For example, in Australia, I know some parts there would be 20 sheep to the acre, and yet in other parts it would be a sheep to 20 acres and even more. In Britain, a plot of land for a family of 4 will tend to be around about 5 acres or slightly larger. And here in the county of Cumberland, if I go and take I can't remember, there was a census at the start of the 20th century, and then there was a census 50 years later, and the difference was just about 20,000 people. And so I know that there were around about 50,000 people, just simply to use a rule of thumb, in the county of Cumberland. If you go and simply look at the land mass and disregard some of the high ground, there is still enough land for every, on average, family of 4 to be able to have their own free plot of land upon which to build their house. Now, this is actually quite a reversal of the industrialization where capitalism runs. This is not capitalism in this context. This is just simply Celtic indigenous communities and how it used to happen. And I'm sure economists could go and actually come up, and have probably come up, with a label that applies to this type of living. But the simple matter is, in a full-blown Celtic revival, you would expect in Cumberland, for example, and right across the land, everyone who had been here for 9 generations or more to be given a 5-acre plot of land. Now let's go back to the 4th generation, so those who had already migrated into this country and were now naturalised, having done so over 3 generations. They are now in their 4th generation. That person, or those people, they'd also be entitled to live a self-sustaining lifestyle on the land. The thing is, though, they don't acquire the right to actually acquire the freehold 5-acre plot. So instead, they would be allocated a similar 5-acre plot. But the question is, where does it come from? Because they're not freemen, it's not allocated to them. So it would be allocated to another Lord Penkenador, another family around the place. You would be associated with that family, and you'd be allocated that croft under such terms that you then would have to, you'd be obligated to provide some sort of annual service in return to the actual family, the Lord Penkenador, simply for your capability to actually be there. And so for the next generation, so from the 4th generation to the 5th to the 6th to the 7th to the 8th, they're your training ground, so that in the 9th generation you then have a Lord Penkenador who's capable of simply not only sitting in the Celtic Indigenous Council, the Celtic House of Lords, so to speak, but he's also capable of administering land that would then be allocated to him. When this immigrant's family gets up to the 9th generation, they become freemen, and they have the same rights as any other 9th generation freeman, that is, any other 9th generation Lord Penkenadal. It goes and raises an interesting question. If a Muslim in this day and age goes and migrates here, and then after 3 generations they're still Muslim, but they've naturalised as a Celt, at that point, from the 4th generation up to the 9th, if they maintain their Muslim Celticity through that, it means that in that context, when they actually became a Lord Penkenadal in the 9th generation, they'd actually be Muslim, presumably under a Muslim, with a Muslim family. And because of the prospect of that, we've got no choice but to realise that in one way or another, we're not talking about necessarily a Christian, purely Christian, Celtic confederation. It's one that relates to the interfaith community. And interfaith community is about the convergence of Christians, Muslims and Jews, but other faiths as well. And in that context, it means that Celticity is a generic way of people integrating, but they're able to maintain their faith, but in the interfaith context. There's a difference between the interfaith context and the non-interfaith context. The interfaith context converges around the similarities of the religions, where the non-interfaith context means they're not converging. It means that the different religions are disputing the differences. And that's the difference between being an interfaith community and a non-interfaith community. And this is why I support the mosque at Dalton in Furness. Look, in the county of Cumbria, which no longer has an administrative council, the county of Cumbria was a failed experiment. It started in 1974 and it finished, the administration finished in 2023 as a failed administration. It didn't work. Everything should have reverted back simply to a county of Cumberland administration, a Westmoreland administration and Lancashire north of the Sands administration, but it didn't. But that's a topic for another video. So in this context, it means that the interfaith community must be something that the Indigenous people extol. They're required to allow the assent of someone under the Indigenous law. If somebody comes in the 4th generation they're Muslim, and by the 9th generation they're Muslim, well, they've still got the right to sit on the National Council, the Indigenous National Council, albeit being a Muslim. And so that means that these people must basically have an interfaith converging empathy for the other faiths around them. Now, although I've mentioned just simply interfaith as being Christian, Muslim and Jewish, I'd just simply like to extend that to also include all other faiths as well as atheists. And there's a reason for doing that, that in the interfaith community of these 3 faiths and Indigenous, we can actually put it in context. So all of Christians, Muslims and Jews have the same God. All of Christians, Muslims and Jews share the Holy Spirit. Now, the Holy Spirit in the English language, as we know, is called the Holy Spirit. In Arabic, for Muslims under Islam, it's called Ruh al-Qudus, R-U-H, the first word, the second word, A-L-K-U-D-U-S. And look, there are variances in spelling depending upon dialect. But Ruh al-Qudus. And in Hebrew, for Jews, the Holy Spirit is Ruach HaKodesh. So R-U-A-C-H, the first word, and the second word, H-A, so capital H-A, hang on, yes, H-A, then capital K, A-D-E-S-H. So it's Ruach HaKodesh. So they're those 3 there. Now, the wonderful thing about that is that I'm going to simply jump across to Muslims now. Muslims accept Jews and Christians as being people of the book, yes, the air quotes, and in doing so they accept the prophets of the people of the book. And unless you're getting into Muslim extremism, there is a great convergence there where there is great respect for one another, simply as separate parts of the same Indigenous, so to speak, community. So that's good. Now, the matter that this is good is because it also goes and accepts that the Jews are part of the peoples of the book. And the great thing about the Jews is that the Jews, who of course the Christians also respect, have a concept called the 7 laws of Noah, which come out of the Torah. It's basically an interpretation of a range of common scriptures. And although in the Bible you won't find the 7 laws of Noah written, the Jewish precept is this: those who are not Jewish, who conform to the 7 laws of Noah, are therefore righteous and will enter the kingdom of heaven. Now that's my paraphrase of it as a Christian, and a Jewish person might go and expound that differently. But the concept of people conforming to the 7 laws of Noah, being righteous and therefore entering the kingdom of heaven, means that anyone of any other faith or non-belief who simply conforms to those is also part of the same righteous, so to speak, community. Now, in the civic sense, this goes and says between these 3 religions, so Christians, Muslims and Jews, there's basically a triangular convergence going on there, where it's as though we have kenning and circumlocution and cipher, and somewhere in the middle it goes and says we can accommodate all of these, not just these 3 religions, but basically everything else, so long as they conform to the 7 laws of Noah. But because we're talking about convergence, we're not being legalistic about this, we're just simply saying this goes and accepts other faiths as well. So that's actually the get out clause there. So that's quite a fabulous way of looking at it. So let me collect my thoughts there, and I'm going to be silent for about 3 seconds, I should think. I'm going to pause. So we're going to move straight on from Article 3 to Article 5. Indigenous peoples have the right to maintain and strengthen their distinct political, legal, economic, social and cultural institutions. Now this is a really wonderful banner to hold over our heads, because can you imagine, for example, there being, for example, in the county of Cumbria, let's say there are 6 newspapers who historically are the major newspapers and they never report Indigenous affairs. Well, in that context, let's read Article 5 again. Indigenous peoples have the right to maintain and strengthen their distinct political, legal, economic, social and cultural institutions. If, for example, these 6 newspapers were reporting everything but not the Indigenous, and yet we know from Article 33 that we have the right to determine our own identity and membership in accordance with our customs and traditions, and we know that from Article 3 that we've got the right to self-determination, we know that we've got the right to freely determine our political status and freely pursue our economic, social and cultural development, then Article 5, if the papers aren't actually reporting us, they're actually being extremely racist, and they need to start looking at that. And it means that we need to also, within our social conduct, we need to start conveying to those papers and to the people at large who read them, this newspaper is not, when I say this newspaper, although I have some in mind, I'm not going to identify them here, but this newspaper in, actually, yes I will, I actually have a book here that I have written and published. This book is available on Amazon Books, Letters to Esteemed Editors of Cumbrian Newspapers. Now, I've identified 6 newspapers in there in the county of Cumbria that I've gone and sent this letter to, and the letter goes and includes also a letter that I wrote to the King. Do I have a copy of that? And yes, I do. So I also have the letter that I wrote to the King. I actually wrote to his principal private secretary, Sir Clive Alderton, and here it is. It's called Letter to Sir Clive Alderton. And so 5 out of these 6 newspapers have received both of these books. This book, though, they received as the original letter, so I didn't actually post on this book. I've gone and simply published this book purely because I wanted the Indigenous community to know what the newspapers had been told, so that when they found that the Indigenous affairs were not being reported by these local newspapers, that in one way or another they could start lobbying them and actually pointing out not just that they're being racist, that being the case if it was so, but also that there is interest within the Indigenous community for people who are not Indigenous to simply be able to understand what's going on, if not just for the reason to allow people who are non-Indigenous, who would like to, given that they are learning about it, to simply naturalise as part of the Indigenous community right of access to the information. So there's that there. I will point out that one of the newspapers has not received this, and that's because I got the postal address wrong. And the editor distribution list, which is Annex B, goes and shows where this has gone, and the newspaper that has not received it, so therefore I have no fault with, is the Keswick Reminder, which, being in the centre of the Lake District, I would expect to report things naturally anyway, because that's where the Christian conventions happen every single year. But the other ones I will mention here, in that they're in Annex B. If you're interested in who's not reporting, have a look at Annex B. The reason why I won't mention them here is because I don't want you to turn your nose up at any newspapers without realising what they've actually been told. So there's that there, and I keep forgetting to watch my monitor, so sometimes I'm not in shot, and I apologise for that. So we've now looked at Article 5, and let's just refresh that. Individual peoples have the right to maintain and strengthen their distinct political, legal, economic, social and cultural institutions. And because we have the right, it is quite apparent that those organisations that go and simply have a view of reporting affairs that happen in the local community, which includes we Indigenous peoples, because the majority of people in Cumberland actually have been here long enough, they've been here more than 9 generations. So all of this information relates to most people in the county of Cumberland and most people in the county of Cumbria who've been here 9 generations or more, because most have. Now let's go to Article 9. Article 9 is quite nice. Indigenous peoples and individuals have the right to belong to an Indigenous community or nation. We have the right to belong to our Indigenous community. We have that right. So where we start getting oppressed, where people are racist to us, where people start complaining about what they think we are or what they think we're not, identify as an Orthodox Celt, there's a small part of the internet that says there's no such thing as a Celt, and yet we know 1,000 years ago that we were part of a Celtic part of Scotland. It's quite incredible for people to simply say there's no such thing as a Celt, because there was. Although it's an exonym and not an endonym, and for those who don't know, the difference between endonym and exonym really goes and shows the difference between what is expressed locally and what is expressed wider afield. I'll give you an example. In Finland, they don't call the country Finland, they call it Suomi. So to a Finn, their country is called Suomi, that's an endonym. To the rest of the world, by large, they're known as Finland. So in that context, the whole of the world simply has the right to go and simply call Suomi by the name of Finland. So there is an endonym and an exonym that can be attached to each circumstance. And if you go and look at our Celtic past, particularly in Cumberland, going back to be part of Scotland, even if they weren't using the word Celt 1,000 years ago, 1,000 years later, we're using the word as an exonym to describe whatever they were using then. We've got the right to call ourselves Celts. And by the time you go and simply put together the worldwide body of evidence, such as Cunliffe and Cox esteemed Celtic from the West theory and all of these things, Celticity obviously is a thing, as is the prospect of simply progressively dismantling the European Union, and in doing so replacing it in parallel with the building up of a Celtic Confederation. So there we are. I've gone and discussed all of the articles that I wanted to. What I'm going to do is simply read out Article 33 again, because really, as this relates to any modern topic of today, I'm really wanting this masterclass to simply culminate in the right of people who are not Indigenous to actually have a pathway to simply walk at their own leisure, so to speak, but in accordance with the actual customs and traditions of the Indigenous nation that they want to naturalise into, to ultimately become so. And because we have this huge immigration crisis, this means that for the people coming in, if we're going to simply go and start claiming Indigenous things and saying, no, you haven't got a right to something to the third generation, or no, you're not going to get something until the ninth, we also have to be able to provide a pathway where they would actually come to do that. So I'm just going to mention Article 33 again, and then I'm going to also give something that's not mentioned here. I'm going to give you a measure of something that the far right particularly want, the far left don't want, but if they realise that a model Indigenous manifesto would cover from the far left to the far right and betwixt, it's likely that the far left would also say, oh, in actual fact we do want this, and that is, how do we slam the doors closed to immigration and just let through a trickle at the old pace, but in accordance with the needs of those who should be coming. So just remembering this, because in what I'm about to say, even the following needs to be in accordance with Article 33. So Article 33, Indigenous peoples have the right to determine their own identity or membership. So membership basically allows us to simply say, for the people coming in a Celtic Renaissance, you either come in and you naturalise into the Indigenous body, or you don't come in at all. Now, that sort of concept would be up to the resolution of the Parliament of the day. And let's just simply say that's either going to be, when it happens, it's either going to be the current Parliament, which is navigating a winding road to Camelot, or it's going to be the new re-established Indigenous Native Council, but elevated sovereignly to prevail over the mass, as though it's done a reverse takeover of the current Houses of Parliament. So in this context, there are probably two things to realise. The first of them is that I've gone and given you the land quota concept, that after the ninth generation, everyone has the birthright to simply receive for free a plot of land, not to sell, because of course it's part of the collective that's redistributed if, for example, you die without an heir, but to be able to simply live on that by birthright. Or if you're somewhere between the fourth generation and the eighth generation, it means that you still get the same allocation, but simply as a croft, where you'd have to perform some sort of annual service to a Lord Penkenador. Now, in that concept, it means that the generality of this is that, let me collect my thoughts. The generality of that is that there's only a certain amount of land that's available. If you go and look at the possibility of how many families within the United Kingdom have already achieved ninth generation status, and also how many who have been here for at least 3 generations, so therefore in their 4th to the 8th, we're actually at a point where we're probably out of land. And I've simply done calculations where I think it's borderline. Other times I go and do it, we're well out of land, and it depends upon what model. And so this needs further research. Now look, the wonderful thing is, not everybody wants to simply live on a 5-acre farm and build their cottage and live their life in absolute bliss. Some people want to live in cities, some people want to live in multiple occupancy, for example, in an abbey as part of a community, or simply in flats servicing a particular part of society that they really enjoy, or simply as servicing any commercial part. And of course there are going to be the great big industries that need to continue, such as military and defence and all of those. Those also wouldn't need to have people living on their own 5-acre plot of land, but they'd have some sort of free allocation if indeed they were part of that other community, but not doing self-sustenance. They were actually servicing another, shall we say, protected sector. So this goes and says, in a full-blown community using indigenous measures, and let's not forget, indigenous peoples have the right of self-determination. So it's the indigenous people that say, under ordinary circumstances, if you're indigenous, you've got the right to this sized amount of land. It means that this land, in one way or another, is of such a size that by the time you simply go and allocate all the birthrights, you get to a number where there's no any longer is simply too large, which means we've run out of land. That's the point of slamming the doors shut. And I believe we're basically there now. It means that if you simply understand all of this indigenous stuff in relation to the genuine indigenous history of Britain, it means that we're there. But you can say probably the same, apply the same thing to Hungary, to Poland, to Kosovo, to North Macedonia, to other places around the Celtic Triangle, to Portugal, to France, to Spain, to the north of Italy, to Austria, to, you can see where I'm going with this, basically everywhere in the Celtic Triangle that's got Celtic roots, which is everywhere apart from, I think, Andorra. And there's no reason why they can't join it as well. They've just got to simply decide to actually, over 3 generations, become Celtic. And that's how Celticity spread to start off with. So we've got a reason where we can use an indigenous measure that can't be compelled. The indigenous people can't be compelled to change that indigenous measure. This is something that's just simply factual. We know that indigenous peoples in the 4th generation onwards have the birthright to live on land that's self-sustainable. That means you just simply divide the whole of the United Kingdom up into the minimum simple land sizes that would allow that to happen, count them up, put an average, for example, a family of 4 in that, and just simply do the math, and you will come up with a population where you say, no, we can't have immigration that goes beyond this. Now, if we get this right and apply this, and Ireland gets this right, it means that the rest of Europe, who are complaining so dreadfully about immigration and the problems, it means that what we can do, we have a indigenous measure which we can apply that is factual. It is factual because indigenous people have the right of self-determination, the right to actually determine it themselves. Therefore, in this context, in one way or another, the whole of Europe has a indigenous measure, a capability to decide when is too much, when are there too many immigrants having come in. And this goes and simply gives us a political motive to be able to say, we can, as indigenous people, we've got the right to say, hey, we're full, the doors need to be closed. Look, Article 46 doesn't say that the states are compelled to listen. They can listen, that is, they can hear, but it doesn't allow us to simply forcibly do it. But at the point where the majority of the population, the majority of the electorate start realising that it's in their interest to simply vote this in, suddenly the concept of there being a model Indigenous manifesto that simply goes and applies all of these principles, but which can be simply plug and play by every single political party who basically accept it and say by common consensus, we understand from the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples that they have these rights, and we also recognise that Article 46 paragraph 2 doesn't compel the government to actually do these things, but because we see that as being the final destination, the Camelot of our dreams, we will start creating a policy that relates to where our political party is at the moment. And any political party from the far left to the far right and betwixt can simply choose wherever they are on that spectrum as their starting point and simply start their in terms of their own manifesto, simply go and start the winding road to Camelot from there. So that's also an excellent opportunity that this UNDRIP, this Universal United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, allows us to simply conjure it up as though it's a phoenix rising from the ashes from our known and accepted traditional customs and traditions. So, as a roundup of everything that we've discussed over whatever period that this has been, these concepts, in one way or another, simply go and give us a foothold to start this journey. Now, I've gone and written 22 books. Some of them are simply books that are so shallow as simply being to books of lyrics of Celtic songs that I've written. Others, there's a series of 3 children's books that's written in a language that simply goes and speaks to children, but at the same level is capable of speaking to adults as well. And those 3 books are simply the childlike introduction to these principles that are devoid of those politics that we've been discussing here, but they do go and introduce all the Brythonic forms of communication and much of the symbolism. And those 3 books are called The Secret Cipher of Chalice Well, The Secret Cipher of Edward the Confessor, and The Secret Cipher of Why There Are Ravens in the Tower of London. And although they go and focus on those 3 things, they're actually an exploration of language simply from the origins of the past in the first book, moving through to 1,000 years ago as to where we were then, simply up to where the ravens are in the Tower of London now. So you can see that really as being a timeline from our deep roots in the midst of the melt of the last ice age, progressing through to 1,000 years ago and then through until now. I've got other books there, such as The Ascent of Arthurian Britain. That's actually an extract from book 2 and book 3 in that series. If you're buying those 3 books, you don't need to buy The Ascent of Arthurian Britain because it's essentially the same. However, it's a good book to have as a good reference. And for adults who simply want a quick expose of The Ascent of Arthurian Britain and the precepts without going into this great need to read 3 big books, that's quite a thin book. That will allow one to... Do I have it here? I don't believe I do. Oh, yes, I do. But I have the old cover, so I'm only going to show you the back. So I have the book, The Ascent of Arthurian Britain, and I also have the Salmon Baptiste. The Salmon Baptiste is interesting because this goes and shows Celtic nation food. Now, Celtic nation food is food that basically was eaten in any Celtic country prior to the year 638. And it goes into the reasons for why the year 638 as well. It's basically the meeting point where the start of Anglo-Saxon Britain had started coming to Britain but hadn't quite conquered, and the year 638 was the date that it was inevitable that the Anglo-Saxons would not be kicked out of Britain by the actual Celts for the reasons explained in the book. It was basically because of a dynastic marriage of the most strategic kingdom in the country, which happens to be the Kingdom of Reged at the exact centre of Great Britain, which of course controlled Earhen Ogleth. If you control Earhen Ogleth, you then control the rest of Britain. That sort of concept. Something the Romans knew even back 2,000 years ago, which is why their Dux Britanniarum was simply focusing on holding the centre of Britain around Hadrian's Wall and that part of what we now call Cumbria, although slightly expanded, it was basically the same region as the Old North, to which the Kingdom of Reged dominated, which then, with that dynastic marriage, went and implied that the Anglo-Saxons would never get out. And because of that, we can simply we can fast forward to the present day to the prophecy, so long as there are ravens in the Tower of London, England and its Commonwealth won't fall. And in that context, I've gone and added "and its Commonwealth." You can probably go and chop that off. But nevertheless, it does simply sit in some conversations. The full one, of course, is "so long as there are ravens in the Tower of London, England will be protected." And in that concept, in that context, English people, that is those who are not indigenous, should fear the first few words, "so long as." It's so long as the ravens are as if chained to the Tower of London, England won't fall, because once those ravens who are as if chained to the Tower of London, once they flee the tower, then these ravens, symbolising the indigenous people of Britain, they will simply cause the peeling back of all the foreign veneers from the land anyway. And so this actually is the last of the four great prophecies of Arthurian Britain, which it would be remiss of me not to mention. So in closing, I'm going to mention the four great prophecies of Arthurian Britain. The first is, "so long as the head of Bran faces south on Britain's White Mount, Britain will be protected." Now, this is very, very ancient, and it basically means, I can translate it for you without going into the story. So long as the head of Bran, now Bran is the Welsh word for raven, so it means so long as the head of the raven. Now, the head of the raven, because the raven is symbolic of indigenous Britain, and therefore indigenous Britons, the head of the raven is the leadership of Britain, the leadership of the Britons. So long as the leadership of the Britons face south on Britain's White Mount, Britain will be protected. Face south. The curious thing is, Celts ordinarily faced the east, as evidenced by all the round houses whose entrances faced the dawn, the rising sun. To the Celts' mindset, if they were to draw a map, and of course they didn't because they were oral, the east was to the front, or the east would be at the top of the map, and of course that goes and puts the north to the left and the south to the right. But to the Celts, the south was where the inspiration came from. If inspiration comes from the source of the unseen south. Now we know in the north there's the North Star and all the stars revolve around it, but in the south, of course, the South Celestial Pole, there isn't a star. Now that's the unseen south. So the source of the unseen south, that's where inspiration comes from. And the great thing is, you then think, well, what is that inspiration? And although all Celts face the south in doing that, it depends who you are, what your religion or faith is, as to what the motivation is. So this allows all of the Celtic people to have a symbolism that simply works for all of them, where one can say, well, we believe the source of the unseen south is to be the Holy Spirit. Someone else can say it can be something else. Now, but on the Christian side, why this works for, in particular, Muslims and Christians, but to a large degree also for Muslims and Jews and Christians, is that simply when you face the east, the source of the rising sun can be said to be the rising of Christ in our lives. Now we know Christ said that he had to go to heaven to sit at the right hand of the Father. Now because we're facing the east and we're talking about Christ having to go to heaven to sit at the right hand of the Father, in facing the east, the right points to the South Celestial Pole, and of course Christ said that he had to rise into heaven to do that so that the Holy Spirit could come. And so in the Celtic sense, because we know that Arthur is historically said to have gone into battle under the banner of Mary, so therefore was Christian, we can go and apply that as a Christian meaning. And in that sense, that means that so long as the head of Bran, so long as the leadership of Britain face south, that means so long as the leadership of Britain face the direction of the Holy Spirit upon Britain's White Mount, Britain will be protected. And that's a bit hard to argue with. For a Christian and for a Muslim and for a Jew who all share the Holy Spirit, and in that context leadership comes from the Holy Spirit, it means that that's where our protection comes from. So that's quite a fabulous thing. But we must also remember, so long as the head of the raven, or so long as the leadership of Britain faces south on Britain's White Mount, it means we must also ascend the White Hill of Holiness. Simple as that. And then Britain will be protected. Now the curious thing is, in the Welsh doctrine, that White Mount is a hill that just happens to be a hill called Gwynfryn, which is basically the White Hill, and it's the exact same hill that the Tower of London is currently built on. So this is why we suddenly get into the fourth great prophecy, which I'll mention in a minute. Let's go to the second of the four great prophecies of Arthurian Britain. The second of the fourth great prophecies of Arthurian Britain is quite simply this, and that is the red dragon will be temporarily wounded by the white dragon, but then the red dragon will rise and kill the white dragon. That's basically talking about the red dragon being the symbol for Indigenous Britain rising to eventually prevail over Britain, which, if you want to simply put it in a politically correct circumstance, goes and says that by the white dragon having been killed by the red dragon, the effect will be that we will have simply gone and peeled back all of the foreign veneers from over Indigenous Britain in that sense. And that way, of course, the red dragon will prevail. Now, the third great prophecy of Arthurian Britain is the prophecy that Arthur will return as a raven. So here we need to define, what does Arthurian mean in the label of the four great prophecies of Arthurian Britain? Now, Arthurian doesn't mean Arthur. So Arthurian comes from the Welsh, the Brythonic word arth, A-R-T-H, and it means bear. And so we're looking at the symbol of the bear, and of course in all of our previous discussions on the triptych of Owen, where we have the kenning and we have circumlocution, we have secret cipher, out of all of that and simply going through and adding a whole bunch of other ciphers and simply comparing them all, we basically come back to simply the same thing, even as expounded by the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People. We have culture, we have heritage, it is to be protected. So in the Arthurian way of saying that is that the word Arthurian simply means to stand the ground of defending our heritage as a bear would. Bears stand the ground to defend the territory to the death. That's what that's all about. And that was a symbol that would have occurred long before the age of Arthur, which is 350 AD to 650 AD. It would have occurred a long time before that. And so, of course, given that those symbols were already pre-existing in Britain, when the Anglo-Saxons finally arrived, you can understand by common consensus, somebody being raised by common consensus, by popularity of the common people, to the titular role of Arthur. And this, to a certain degree, goes and resolves where Arthur came from. He was raised to the titular role. He wasn't born with the birth name Arthur. He was simply elevated to a position, a titular position, of being Arthur the Bear. He was the guy who everyone was behind in terms of the era of that age, where the only way to kick out the Anglo-Saxons was to fight them. So he was the person raised to the titular role of being Duke Arthur, the Dux, the battlefield warrior, whose primary role was to lead people into battle to defend the heritage of the indigenous peoples of this land, doing so as a bear would. So that's where Arthurian comes into it. So with the third great prophecy of Arthurian Britain being Arthur will return as a raven, that's actually forward-looking. That goes and says, because we're talking about these prophecies today, it means Arthur is yet to come, and that means that at some stage there will be somebody who draws the double-edged sword of truth from the stone of contempt, or the stone of untruth, the stone where the word is not valid. It means that when that person is elevated by common consensus of the people to the titular role of Arthur, he will be standing the ground to defend the indigenous heritage of Britain, but doing so in the context of him being a raven. Arthur will return as a raven. Well, what does the raven mean? Well, the raven is the symbol of Indigenous Britain. All Indigenous Britons are ravens, but why did they choose that in the first place? Well, this goes back to in the thousands of years before Christ. The Celts were known to go to war under the sign of the raven. Now, in Romania, there's a helmet. It's a helmet from around, I would say, 400 BC in a place called pronunciation error here perhaps, Cuyamesti, Cuiemesti. It's a place in Romania where this helmet was found, and it was a metal helmet which had a raven on top with mechanical wings, and as the warrior, the Celtic leader, went into battle, the Celtic wings flapped. This is a case of the flight of the raven. What does the symbolism of the raven means? Well, this helmet was built around 400 BC. Now, the curious thing is that's about 100 years after the book of Genesis was finished. Not started, but finished. And we can go to the story in the book of Genesis about the Great Flood, and we can see what the symbolism of the raven actually meant. And this is not simply being religious and saying, oh yes, these old scriptures that are recognized by Christians and Muslims and Jews must be accepted as definitely meaning that the Celts had this symbol. It's the other way around. This is just simply a scripture from the old world, from about the same time, from about the same wide region, that showed what the old world thought that the symbol of the raven meant. Now, here it's quite curious to simply think about the concept of the Great Flood in the story of the Great Flood in the book of Genesis as being symbolic and not literal. Now, the reason why that's an advantage is because if we consider it to not be literal, we've got to ask the question, why did the wise old sage who wrote that story include the symbol of the raven in the actual story? And if you go and simply look at the actual verses, Noah had been on the flood for something like 40 days, and he then simply opened the door and released the raven. And if you go and simply look at the exact words in the actual, for example, King James Version, the raven flew back and forth across the earth until it could simply find a place to rest. If you go and simply look at those words, he beat his wings until the waters had receded from off the earth. And in that context, we just simply know that the raven was there at the start of the adversity, and during the adversity he flew back and forth. It was the beating of his wings that symbolically went and drove away the waters of the Great Flood. And in modern terms we can say, because we can represent water as spirit, we can say it's the role of the raven to simply fly back across the earth, and it's the beating of its wings that goes and dries up the false spirits of the age. So it's quite a very, very good set of symbolism that this old sage wrote. But then fundamentally the raven got to the other side of the actual adversity. Now we know that because after Noah released the raven, he then released a dove, and that of course is the dove of peace. And the dove goes out, but it couldn't find a foothold for its foot so that it could rest, and it simply came back. And then Noah released it again later, and it eventually came back with a sprig of an olive leaf in its beak. And of course the curious thing is, we know that the first time that it went out, because it couldn't find an olive leaf to simply come back, it's because the waters of the flood had not receded to a level where it could. And so this goes and applies a sense of purpose. Eventually the dove goes and actually comes back with an olive leaf. Now, an olive sprig is a symbol of peace, isn't it? And he only came back with an olive leaf. So that just simply means that the waters had receded, and by coming back with an olive leaf, it means that the symbolism there basically goes and says there's an order here. And the order is, first, the raven flies back and forth over the waters of the Great Flood, the beating of its wings, drying up the false spirits of its age. That is, imagine the warrior in his helmet going into battle. Then basically it's first the raven does its job, then the dove of peace is released. And when the dove of peace is released, of course, it's got the olive leaf in its mouth, meaning that there will be peace. But to get from the leaf to the sprig, it means the piece has to be rebuilt. And so there's a natural sense of order there. Now, this is basically just simply symbolism that we know from an old manuscript from the old world, about 100 years before we know the Celts were already going into battle with these symbols. And it goes and explains why the Celts of Britain and other nations basically saw themselves as being ravens. in this context, in the terms of all of the different countries in the Celtic Triangle becoming, what should we say, moving into a renaissance, a revival, it means that no matter what country, all of those Celts can simply see themselves as ravens, whether they be ravens asleep in the nest awakening, whether they be awakening, whether they just simply be young ravens or ravens that have simply launched and are now flying back and forth across the sky according to the maturity. Nevertheless, they are still ravens. Ravens get from one side of adversity to the other. That's their predestiny. And in this context, it means that a Celtic revival, a full-blown Celtic revival, would inevitably mean all of the people of Europe, if it came to a Celtic confederacy, it would mean that all of these people would fundamentally see themselves as Celts. Now, curiously, we're going to get back to the triptych of Owen. See themselves not just as Celts, but also, I should say, ravens. And the raven, therefore, is somebody, whether it be as a warrior or just simply somebody who, through his actions, whether they're political or social, gets from one side of adversity to the other. That's the basic vision. So I'm now going to simply get to almost finishing this, because after this little bit, I've then got to simply reflect again on the fourth great prophecy, which we've already mentioned. But in terms of them being ravens, let's go back to the triptych of Owen. So we have the equilateral triangle, where on the left we have rising to the ascent, that's the kenning. Then it goes and falls away through circumlocution down to simply getting back to the cipher, which is at the bottom of that equilateral triangle. That's a very academic way of explaining that. I can actually use symbols to go and explain that. And rather than applying the symbols to each of the three parts of the equilateral triangle, instead we go and apply them to the point. And of course we're going once again from left through to right. So the left bottom point, that symbol would be an owl. As you go up, simply rise up to the centre, you've basically got the eagle. The eagle is the eagle of evangelism. And as it falls down then to the bottom corner that goes and simply connects back with the cipher and goes across to the owl, at that point, that is the raven. And the wonderful thing is, because the triptych of Owen relates to Brythonic communication, it can also be seen to relate to Celtic communication. And in this sense, it is the owl that simply holds the doctrine. It is the owl who communicates the wisdom of Celtic understanding to the eagle of evangelism. It's the eagle of evangelism that simply listens to what the owl has said. The owl doesn't go and put the words into the mouth of the eagle of evangelism, because remember, the circumlocution, it's up to the listener to infer the meaning of what's being presented to them. This is the difference with Brythonic communication. So although the eagle of evangelism has heard the wisdom from the owl, the eagle goes and infers what it will say to the raven. And of course, the raven, being the listener, hears the eagle speaking to it. The raven then goes and infers the meaning despite what the eagle has actually communicated to it. And so from that, it's as though, in a sense, we have the bishop, we have the evangelist, and then we have the Christian soldier, to put it into that context. But in other senses, if you go back to, for example, the warrior in Romania in 400 BC, that would have been simply perhaps the druidic wisdom of the counsellors. It would simply be the eagle of evangelism, and it would have been the raven, the warrior. And so there's that sense. So that's actually quite nice. So let's move on simply to the fourth great prophecy of Arthurian Britain, and all of that lead up gets back to talking about ravens. So long as there are ravens in the Tower of London, England will be protected. We remember, so long as is the hope that the ravens who are as if chained to the Tower of London, that they will be released by some fiduciary legal means. And because they're released, it means that they will be free to fly back and forth over the land, and it will be the beating of their wings that will simply dry all of the false spirits of the age, and in that sense there will be a Celtic Renaissance and everything else will come to pass according to what the genuine prophets of the day would realise or say. And therefore we can just simply go and look at some of the symbolism. Look, in the year 638, that was when the Kingdom of Reged, it was the last indigenous queen of the Kingdom of Reged. Her name was Riandvelt, and she married Prince Oswy. Oswy was the brother of the 6th Anglo-Saxon High King, the Bretwalda, and he was also the king of Northumberland. But Oswy himself then became the king of Reged and was there with the Queen of Reged. It was unfortunate that in the year 642, Oswy's brother died, and that meant that the 6th Anglo-Saxon High King would be killed, and Oswy was thrown into not just looking after Reged, but basically trying to restore the kingship of the High King to Northumberland, because his brother had been defeated. No longer was the king who defeated him underneath him, so therefore the office of High King went into interregnum, which meant it was empty. And then after 13 years, Oswy managed to simply get all of the Anglo-Saxon heptarchy, all of the kingdoms, under his own subjection, including the Kingdom of Reged, which he was now king of by right. But unfortunately, of course, Riandvelt had died, but nevertheless he was still the king of Reged. Now, the significance of this, other than Oswy founding the Synod of Whitby in the year 664, which was the birthplace of the Church of England, the very significant thing here is that the Kingdom of Reged, when Queen Riandvelt married Oswy, her great-grandfather was Urien, King of Reged. Urien, King of Reged, was known as Urien, King of the Ravens. Now look, every indigenous Celt could be called a raven. The significance, though, of Urien being called King of the Ravens was because Reged was the most strategic Celtic kingdom in the centre of what we call Earhan Ogleth, and it was looking like Reged will go and simply kick the Anglo-Saxons out. Unfortunately, when it was about to happen, there was a battle on Lindisfarne, and it was inevitable that the English kings were going to be defeated. One of the Reged members went and assassinated King Urien of Reged, that is King Urien, King of the Ravens. And this goes and simply illustrates that for that period, the indigenous leadership of Britain who assassinated King Urien of Reged were not up on England's White Mount facing south, and so therefore, because Urien was defeated, it meant that those Anglo-Saxon kings stayed in power, and because of that, the Anglo-Saxon heptarchy continued right down to the present day. But that goes and introduces the concept of the ravens. Because of the dynastic marriage in the year 638 of Riandvelt to Oswy, then that meant that the ravens of Reged, who as indigenous Celts were committed to kicking out the immigrants, the foreign veneers that had been laid over them, the Anglo-Saxons, it meant that they were legally required by the terms of that marriage to simply go and defend the Anglo-Saxons. So a symbolism of that, although the Tower of London wasn't built then, we do know about the first of the four great prophecies: so long as the head of the raven faces south on Britain's White Mount, Britain will be protected. By the time we get to 1066 and the Tower of London being built, that had evolved, but recognising the fact that the ravens of Reged were as if chained to the Anglo-Saxons. That is, they were obligated by duty to defend the Anglo-Saxons, and because of that, the ravens of Reged, so this is the raven, this is my indigenous countrymen going back centuries, had become a curse to the rest of Britain. Now, the curious thing is, up until 638, Reg, for the Kingdom of Reged, meant gift, basically, and the name Kingdom of Reged meant the Kingdom of Gifts, or the Kingdom of Gifted Prosperity. The very curious thing is that in Welsh, if you go and simply take reg, if you go and put the word UN in front of it, it goes and reverses the meaning. So prior to this marriage, reg, meaning gift, meant gift. And so the Kingdom of Reged meant the Kingdom of Gifted Prosperity. But from 638 and afterwards, because Rhianvel married the Anglo-Saxon who became the Anglo-Saxon High King, it meant then that to all of the other Brythonic nations in Britain, it meant that the Kingdom of Reged had become a curse. And so, because of that, in the common vernacular of Welsh, and if you look at a Welsh dictionary, it's this way today, rather than reg meaning gift, because they go and simply reverse it and put UN in front of it, if you want gift now in Welsh, you have to go to unreg, and guess what? Reg now means curse, and that's because of what happened in 638. This allows us to conflate that with the symbolism of the ravens in the Tower of London being as if chained. That is, they're cursed to be chained. That is, they're cursed to serve the Anglo-Saxons, and that's why this prophecy works. So long as there are ravens as if chained to the Tower of London, those ravens are compelled to serve the Anglo-Saxons, and therefore England will be the beneficiary of that. England will be protected. But you see, in doing so, we've still got the first great prophecy of Arthurian Britain. So long as the head of the leadership of the indigenous people of Britain face south on Britain's White Mount, England will be protected. So those ravens are still on Britain's White Mount. They're actually symbolically the ravens in the Tower of London, the same White Mount. The first prophecy conflates with the fourth prophecy to mean that. So whilst I've been talking and summarising that, because I know this quite well, I've also realised, let's get back to the birth date of Britain. I'm going to finish this with the birth date of Britain. We know that the year 6170 happens to be the birthplace of Britain, and I didn't complete this story earlier. And the reason why we know that is that at the time after the melt of the last ice age, basically the sea level was so much lower the closer you get back to the ice age. But as it started melting and warming, the sea level started getting higher and higher and higher. And we know that the North Sea started getting, it used to be completely doggerland, and most of the actual land, apart from the region called the something or other of Norway, there's an arc of land, the Norwegian Trench around Norway, it was the only sea there, and all the other, what we now call the North Sea, was actually land. And as the water from the ice pack started melting, it meant the water level in the North Sea started rising, and Doggerland got flooded. Now, the reason why this is significant is up until this period of time, up until 6170, there was no English Channel all the way through. And the great thing here is that that means that we know that what we now call Great Britain and Ireland was just simply a northwestern panhandle of mainland Europe. But there was what's called the Storegga Slide. Now, the Storegga Slide was a tsunami that occurred in the year 6170 or thereabouts, and it was actually a series of 3 tsunamis, but we tend to group them simply under the one terminology of the Storegga Slide because it started sliding, it happened 3 times, all part of the same slide in effect, and one of those tsunamis is said to have opened up the English Channel, from which time it means that the people in mainland Great Britain in particular became aware that they were totally a people on a single island, and from there our character started evolving. And this is rather splendid because the evolving character of a people that suddenly realise that they're part of the same island compared to people on the continent and from elsewhere, They realise they're the same people, and this is where the indigenous nature of Britain really started to solidify. So you can say that the year 6170 was the birthplace of modern Britain as we know it. And everything leading up to that was still a part of the ascent of Arthurian Britain from time immemorial to the present, because the symbolisms that have come down, even at the year 6170, were inherited from the past through the same people and transmitted down to us today. So that's actually quite a fond story. We know what year Britain, indigenous Britain, was born. It was the year 6170. So this was an articulation discussing ways for people who are not indigenous to become part of, to naturalise, to find a pathway into an indigenous community, and in doing so be seen, once they had naturalised, as simply part of the indigenous community itself. So in this context, we've done a workshop where we've looked at simply native Britons as a workshop, as an example. We've covered the whole of Europe, showing the prospect of how there can be a domino effect of similar people simply reviving. We've shown the possibility that this may be a solution, a pan-European solution to dismantle, to progressively dismantle the European Union and rebuild it instead into a Celtic confederacy, which is probably what all the Remainers would prefer anyway. And in doing so, we can all retain our own sovereignty, and yet in various contexts, it means that we can all, in one way or another, have the same benefits that we simply would have wanted to have or used to have. And I'll give an example of how the naturalisation path into Britain to become an indigenous Celt for somebody coming from the outside might work in terms of a Celtic confederacy. So remembering that it took 3 generations to naturalise as a Celt, that would mean that in the context of a Celtic confederacy, it might mean that people who had 3 generations of Celticity in their own country would have the right of free travel throughout Europe. But people who hadn't yet quite reached that would simply only have local national rights. Now, there will be the inevitable discussion that this is racist, but the simple matter is, this actually comes from indigenous customs and precepts, which, if ratified, would provide a solution. Immigrants coming in are not indigenous, so there's no automatic right, or there wouldn't be any automatic right, to engage with another part of the Celtic Confederacy until you had actually achieved Celticity itself. So this goes and shows a controlled method. It would also illustrate and perhaps slow down the migration from other countries worldwide, where people are just seeing this country as being social security and simply free handouts, free houses, free everything. Because the simple matter is, an immigrant coming in now who would not attain naturalisation status for 3 generations, that immigrant therefore would not have the right of housing on for example, a block of land that was 5 acres, big enough to be self-sustaining. So the question is then, how are those people housed? Those people have got to work for it. Those people, they don't get the Celtic birthright. These things should slow down a lot of people wanting to come to Europe or to Britain or any of the particular countries, because it's going to be 3 generations before they actually get it. A lot of people will come. These 3 generations can be done in a single lifetime, because it's basically someone comes, they have a child near when they get here, and then after 20 years that child then goes and has a child, and before you know it, 3 generations have passed, and then it's happening. But it does go and simply slow down the whole box and dice. It also simply goes and retards everything to a slow enough state where the economics aren't simply unravelled and threatened as they currently are. So there are many good reasons, but the purpose here is not to extol a particular model Indigenous manifesto. For those who have been following my TikTok account, you'll see that my plan is to do a Master of Arts and simply in that undertake a model Indigenous manifesto en route to simply doing a doctorate for the same thing. So that's basically the direction I'm headed for. There is time between now and the 2029 election to achieve that. So to a certain degree, much of what I've said now will plug and play into a model Indigenous manifesto. So I've been talking for more hours than I simply want to, but this is the information that I'm now prepared to upload to YouTube. So it's been a wonderful opportunity to discuss these things. I've not broken unless I really had to, so you can see the good reason for me having to break. The advantage of me doing that is that you can see these things just simply rise from my body. My body is a repository of the oral word, and it just simply rises and overflows like a fountain. It's all in there. And my reason perhaps for wanting to delay would be so that I would be better and more eloquent in actually presenting it. But the whole point of this is that if we're going to go back to Celticity, we have to be prepared to learn to be oral repositories where our word rises and overflows from the repository of our body as a fountain. And in doing so, we have to learn how to best communicate. And even if we're getting into politics, the electorate wants to know that these things are an intricate part of our spirit, body and soul. And one of the great reasons I always love enjoying videos where people continually talk from start to finish without stopping. Now, occasionally you need to stop because you'll suddenly find yourself tongue-tied, and very rarely in my TikTok videos I do it, but I think I've got 2 or 3 videos where I have stopped. But I prefer doing 10-minute talks without stopping, because if you can do those regularly, or even 3-minute talks, it means that you're totally capable of people seeing where you're at, and it means that as you do it, each time you do it, you become better capable of doing a better presentation next time. We're on this winding road to Camelot, where Camelot is the final destination. Camelot is basically the remanifestation of the golden Indigenous heritage of we Brythonic Britons. That's the Camelot in Britain. Other countries may have their own Camelot, but it won't be too far different. So God bless and peace be upon you all, and please do look out for my next masterclass.